say we are going to record the proceedings today for the purpose of, thank you very much, for the purpose of sharing the insights from our presenters in the future on YouTube. Just so hope everyone is okay with that. I don't think it shows the names of any individuals. It just shows the speaker. Everyone should have the program by now, at least I hope you do. We have a 3-hour conference planned, so you can pop in and out. You can keep yourself on mute, please, and sort of blast the proceedings on the speaker for your neighborhood to listen to the speeches that we have planned today. Let me start just by making a note, which is that we have a series of a movement, what we might call a movement for justice around the murder of a Black man called by the name of George Floyd. And this is something which we are all in sort of deep solidarity with, and we have a sort of profound interest in the development of these activities taking place all throughout the United States at this point, or in major cities. So full solidarity with Black Lives Matter and with the movement for justice. Many of the people who wanted to be on this event are in the streets, so that's maybe even better. We're meeting today to talk about the French political theorist and militant activist Sylvain Lazarus, who is an incredibly interesting figure for the world, really. He comes out of a very unique French rationalist tradition of political thought, I would say. He was marked by an encounter of the May '68 events and formulated a theory of emancipatory politics from both personal experience and militant work over the course of, I don't know, 40 or 50 years. And has written a magnum opus, which we have all, or most of us have read over the last 4 weeks, which has the title Anthropology of the Name. It is an exceptional book. It's a strange production of thought, strange in its simplicity. It proposes that politics begins in a mode of interiority, and it presents a kind of practical schema for how we can gauge the novelty of political activity in our time. It's a book which I find is worth revisiting multiple times reading. It invokes theoretical history. It invokes Marxist history and thought, and pulls from a whole number of social science disciplines for which it radically critiques all of those said disciplines. So there's something very simple about its transmission, and there is also something very elusive about it at the same time. So we thought we would begin today with a keynote address from a scholar who's dedicated the last several decades in this similar problematic as Lazarus, which is emancipatory politics. So we have with us Michael Neocosmos. We're very grateful for his presence. Neocosmos is the author of a book called Thinking Freedom in Africa, which was awarded the Franz Fanon Award for Outstanding Book in Caribbean Thought by the Caribbean Philosophical Association. Michael, in coordination with Ernest Wamba Diawamba and others, have really stood out as some of the most important thinkers of emancipatory thought throughout the continent of Africa and beyond. We have invited Professor Neocosmos to address us with full recognition that many of us now have read the book. We haven't fully finished it. In fact, that's another thing we need to meet for a final time to discuss the studies chapter. But nonetheless, we thought Michael would be willing to give us a talk about what he finds novel, useful, important, and of vital interest for humanity and for emancipatory thought in the work of Lazarus. So with that said, Michael, feel free to begin, and the format will be Michael will give a talk for 15 to 20 minutes or longer, and we'll have a group Q&A. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I perhaps should start by saying how I came across Lazarus's work. His book was recommended to me by Ernest Wamba Diawamba in the 90s. His book was first published in French. You can see the French copy here. It's falling apart. In 1996. So the two books that really influenced my thinking in the late 90s, I think I started reading it in 98 or 99, and I struggled through it, was that book and Badiou's book called Peut-on penser la politique? Can politics be thought? Which has recently been translated into English by Bruno Bostez, and which came out, I think, a couple of years ago now. So both of those were had a major effect on me because I was struggling to think what happened in the case of South Africa when there was such an obvious transition from a period where popular politics was dominant with various characteristics to one in which state politics became overwhelmingly dominant. And this was taking place as I was thinking about this in the late 90s. So my trajectory, if you like, was one of thinking, how does one make sense of the failure of so many struggles for liberation and emancipation? Because there's always a kind of an emancipatory content in struggles for liberation in Africa. How does one try to make sense of the constant, or what Fanon seems to say is a law, see as a law, whereby the state systematically takes over and undermines completely the gains or the struggles which ordinary people have been involved in. Why is it? How come this is repeated again and again and again? And of course, both Badiou and Lazarus deal with this issue in relation to the Soviet Union. That's why Badiou's book, Can Politics Be Thought, is so important. And of course, China, which had a major effect on their politics. So then I started to get access to some of the material that was published by l'Organisation Politique, which was the political organization that both those two characters were involved in. And also eventually met one of Lazarus's students who had written a PhD on South Africa. And then we kind of moved from there. And then eventually I wrote this book, which Daniel has mentioned, which refers quite substantially to Lazarus's work. And I use his work quite a lot in the book. So that, if you like, is like the historical background a little bit about how I came across this stuff. And of course, it was translated very, very recently. So I had the advantage of having a bit of a, because I could speak French, but it's very difficult to read. I mean, it's very difficult. The translator's done a wonderful job. I have to admit that I started translating it myself and was really battling with it. But because of that effort and trying to translate it, I managed to get into it at some depth. So I think to start fundamentally, it's this idea that, you know, how he puts it, politics is of the order of thought. Right? So politics is purely subjective and it's a thought. Okay, so that's the first thing. Politics isn't about power, or at least you can't think of it in terms of power. Politics isn't about the balance of class forces. It's not, you can't derive it from class interests. It's a thought. Now, having said that, there's a problematic aspect, and which I'm sure you have come across in reading the book, is that it's not always clear when Lazarus is talking about politics and when he's talking about emancipatory politics. The two tend to kind of be used interchangeably. So you think he's talking about emancipatory politics. And that's when he talks about what he calls politics that are understood in interiority. Is that how I haven't checked the translation, but is that what the translator says? Internally or in interiority? So there's a number of, I will come to the idea of modes in a minute, but then there's some which are in exteriority. And the point about the ones I find problematic is that the ones in exteriority basically refer to an external referent, which is usually the state, okay? Now those, I'm not too clear, I've never been clear actually as to why those are politics, or how do they make sense as specific political sequences. Okay, so let me come back. You've obviously been reading about this. What's fundamental to him is A, politics is of the order of thought, and B, it doesn't always exist. So sometimes there is politics, and sometimes there isn't politics. We'll come back to when there is, because I think it's rather important. But for the moment, if we can say, all right, there are times when politics doesn't exist. That means that when it does, it has a limited life, and that's when he talks about historical sequences of politics. So politics is sequential. It happens, it arises, and then it fades away. And it fades away because what he calls it's saturated. Okay? It becomes saturated. It gets to a point where it can't deal with the issues that it was dealing with. That form of thought can't handle the questions and the problems which it has to address. And that is when you find that overwhelmingly it's the state that takes over. Incidentally, I suppose you have access, some of you may have read Badiou's article on the Cultural Revolution. Because there at the beginning, he actually states, I'm going to use the method of saturation of Sylvain Lazarus. So it's actually a good example of how this idea of saturation operates. The particular example of it. Although you're going to see when you study the studies at the end of the book that he also talks about that. So the whole point is then that politics has got a limited lifespan. Now, he doesn't really explain why it has a limited lifespan, but it has a limited lifespan. I think one can provide an explanation for it, but he doesn't. He just tells you that it rises and then it kind of peters out, or it comes across obstacles which it can't overcome. In thought, the thought comes across obstacles which it can't. But anyway, what's fascinating is that Lazarus and I suppose with Badiou and with Rancière, are three of the thinkers who attempt to account for politics in its own terms. In other words, they don't derive politics from, say, the class struggle or the state or whatever, but try to make sense of it in its own terms. And I think that's what's so important about what he's trying to do. So what we've achieved so far is A, that it's subjective, it's sequential. He's also got this expression where he says, politics is at a distance from the state. I think that's very, 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 very important. What does it mean by distance from the state? What he means by the idea of distance is not physical distance, it's subjective distance. In other words, you can't think like the state thinks. Okay? So any emancipatory politics has to think outside the parameters of state thought. And this is where his idea of politics in exteriority becomes problematic, because it is state thought. But anyway, I mean, I think if we forget about the politics in exteriority and we only think about what is really theorized, politics in interiority, in other words, politics which tries to understand politics in terms of its own categories itself, then I think we can kind of move, we can grasp, we'll start to grasp what he's talking about. Let me now say a few words. I said, politics exists at a distance from the state. It is, if it's emancipatory, it's thought in terms of itself. It's internal to its own thinking. Now, what's very important for Lazarus is that politics, that emancipatory politics, only exists in sites, in what he calls specific sites, les lieux, specific sites. Now, it's important to distinguish sites from place, and sometimes the translator doesn't do that, so I'm a bit kind of, you have to be rather careful. A site for Lazarus, a political site, is identified by a prescription. In other words, the sites are places where that subjectivity, that political subjectivity arises and prescribes, makes a prescription. Very frequently, these prescriptions take the place of slogans. For example, for Lenin, the obvious one that everyone talks about, all power to the Soviets, okay? Well, that's a prescription in the form of a slogan about what we would like to see. So the prescription is not what exists, but what could be, okay? So the distinct difference he makes between prescription and description is that description is simply how the world, how it exists. And prescription is how we would like it to be and how that politics would like it to be. Okay? And the prescriptions then differ. That means that politics differs from one sequence to another sequence. So the politics in the French Revolution are thought within certain categories and certain ways of thinking, and they make certain prescriptions. The politics of the Russian Revolution are thought within certain categories. They exist within certain sites, and they make certain prescriptions as to what should be happening. Okay, and I mentioned that idea of the all power to the Soviets. So the idea of prescription is very, very important for Lazarus. There can't be politics without prescription, or it can't be emancipatory politics, I suppose, without prescription. So that's what distinguishes an emancipatory form of politics, is that it exists only in a site, and that site is identified by the kind of prescriptions that it's making, or that it's putting across. And when the site ceases to exist, politics ceases to exist. So when the Soviets ceased to exist, the politics of emancipation of the Russian Revolution ceased to exist along with it. Sites can be anything. I mean, they don't need to be thought of as places, actual physical places. They can be organizations, they can be, even churches or whatever, where that idea of an alternative appeal to universality and equality emanates from. Okay. So I don't know how am I doing? Are we okay so far?
It's going great. Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. So probably the last concept, and the one which you are probably the most familiar with, is this idea of modes of politics. So a mode of politics is the particular form which politics takes, the particular way in which various subjectivities are combined into some kind of coherent whole. So that a mode of politics then characterizes a sequence. So a sequence is characterized by a specific mode of politics. So a mode of politics is always sequential, if you like. So the mode of politics, so the mode of politics, for example, which is thought by what does he use? He uses the French Revolution. He calls it the revolutionary mode. He talks about the Russian Revolution. What does he call it? He calls, if I remember rightly, he calls it the Bolshevik mode. Then there's the Mao, and he calls that the dialectical mode, and so on. So he gives names to these various modes in order to distinguish them. So there isn't, if you like, in Lazarus's thought, some idea of a unitary Marxism underlying everything, and that these various forms of politics are basically Marxist, and then they are completely different. They are completely distinct, and they're thought of in completely distinct ways, because their concepts and their categories within which they are deployed, with which they operate, are completely distinct. They don't operate in exactly the same way at all. So in a sense, that's what he's talking about, it seems to me. And you can, and I tried in my book, maybe Daniel must have noticed it, to identify various forms of politics. You can actually see it happening. For example, I did one of my chapters is on Haiti, and you can see in the struggle of the slaves in Haiti how the thinking of politics changes over time, and it's not just the same thing. It's not just we want to be free. There is different ways of thinking freedom. The idea of independence, comes in later, and so on and so on. So I think it's very, very useful as a way of orientating our thought around the possibility of emancipatory politics. Now, perhaps before ending, I should say two things. First of all, Lazarus is an anthropologist, and he argues that the thought of politics has to go through anthropology, that you have to have you have to deploy some anthropological techniques in order to be able to understand politics. And that's an anthropology which studies basically subjectivity. So at times he seems to be talking about politics as if they're just idioms that people are using in politics. And in Africa, like in many other parts of what used to be called the third world or the global south now, politics is not always expressed in terms which in the West we consider to be politics. For example, people frequently use religious idioms in order to be able to express politics. And we also know that politics can be expressed in poetry and in other forms of in other idioms. So there is a sense in which anthropologists have to kind of analyze these various idioms. I used politics in a specific sense, and sometimes you find this in Lazarus, sometimes you don't. I myself have used it. I say politics exists when there is some kind of idea of excess over the thinking which is kind of dominant in society, which ends up being state thinking. In other words, the thinking of place. We all exist in one place or another, whether this is class, whether it is gender, whether you have race, whatever you want to call it. We all in one place. But if collectively we can think beyond that and think some kind of idea of universality, then we can see that there is some kind of relationship between place, our location within the social, and some kind of idea of emancipation, which is supposed to be for the whole of humanity, incidentally, and not just for certain interest groups. So maybe I should stop there. How long have I been rambling on for? Probably a little bit more than 20 minutes. So that might be the right place to end, other than to say, if you're looking for material by Lazarus in English, Viewpoint magazine has just published not long ago a translation of his some of his work on worker anthropology and factory inquiry. I don't know if you know this. Are you aware of this, Daniel?
We are, yes. In fact, several members of the Viewpoint editorial team are members of the group.
Oh, okay, excellent. So all right. So other than that, I'm not too sure what has been translated in English other than the anthropology of the name. There's not all that much. He since has come out with another book in French, which is a selection, or rather an anthology, probably of various articles that he has written over the years, including some which are quite old, but it's very, very interesting, but that hasn't been translated yet. It's called The Intelligence of Politics, Intelligence de la Politique. Should I stop there? Do you want me to say anything?
No, I think that's perfect, Michael. Thank you very much for that really wide-ranging set of reflections. It's really helped us get a handle, I think, on the book. So thank you. If I could, I'll just maybe begin with a question which has come up a lot in this group. And I think that is the notion of, we have people right now on this meeting from all around the world, and maybe a handful of people from France. So one question that has come up is, to what extent, and you see this with Badiou as well, to what extent is the model of emancipatory politics that Lazarus is working with, are we able to separate it from the very distinct French tradition and then apply it elsewhere, like, within a specific situation, which is not France? Is there a certain difficulty with doing that, given that you've done that precise thing with Lazarus in Africa? How did that go for you? Did you? I hope my question kind of.
Yeah, no. I mean, I never saw that really as a problem. I don't approach it as an example of French theory. And it's the same way as I've been criticized for using Badiou rather too much in the context of Africa. But I think what is important is, I don't think we should think of it in a positivistic way, like we take it and we apply it. It raises a number, these writings raise a number of questions or point to a number of ways of thinking. And insofar as that mode of thought, to use his kind of expression, helps you to make sense of what is actually happening, then it is useful. For example, what was absolutely fundamental for me is this idea that politics is not the state. That politics cannot be reduced to the state. Of course, the state is something that you have to confront in any kind of collective activity. But it's not about the state. We have to think at a distance, outside state parameters. And to do that, what it helped me understand is that, and that's the anthropological part, I suppose, you have to listen to what people are saying, especially when those people are organized. Okay, so when people are organized themselves around specific questions, and they struggle themselves around specific questions, they don't necessarily go around saying, hey, we are peasants, we are workers, and then, we have to think like peasants or think like workers, but they think in a manner which is unique to them. And that uniqueness very frequently involves ideas of universality. I mean, it's absolutely so interesting, something I've been working on recently, that many African proverbs, for example, contain political ideas, so that you could say that potentially there is within African traditions or cultures some idea of a politics of universality, but that idea is not necessarily translated into action. It's there, grannies tell their grandchildren about it, or around the fire, or whatever the case may be. So, but it doesn't. It's only if it is, if it becomes part of a collective struggle, and if that collective struggle refers to that, if you like that idiom, or that particular proverb, that it becomes embodied within a politics. So it is possible, to use that idea of political subjectivities to understand what people themselves are thinking and how they understand their environment, rather than imposing categories from academia. You see, I've always been, one of the things that frustrated me about much Marxism is the way categories are, are imposed on the way people are thinking, and then people are seen as either deviating from that idea. So the working class is supposed to think in a particular way, and if you don't actually fit within what this, then you require some kind of leadership in order to be able to teach you the right way to think. And that is totally absurd, and it's counterproductive politically. It's counterproductive politically because you have to start by where people are, not some kind of theoretical idea which is derived from supposed leaders. So that in a sense pushed me into some rethinking the dialectic, which is not something that Lazarus talks about. In fact, he's quite opposed to the idea of the dialectic, although he dismisses the dialectic between theory and practice. But I mean, I think there's other ways of thinking the dialectic. So what I'm trying to say is that it's a way of thinking which can help open up vistas, if you like, open up new questions about trying to understand the way ordinary or not so ordinary people are trying to struggle and overcome their difficulties, and understanding that. So there is some kind of relationship then, which has always been a major problematic area between intellectuals and popular struggles.
Thank you very much. Let me open it to the floor and get maybe 2-3 questions. We can take it one by one. We'll have our same format. So if you want to ask a question of Professor Neocosmos, just unmute and jump in, and we'll take it from there, please.
Must I mute? Or how does this work?
No. I'm asking others in the group
unmute.
To unmute, and they can just.
Can I ask one? Or
yeah, quickly, okay. Please go.
Yeah, sure. Michael, thank you so much for your presentation and for your work, which I'm reading now. I wasn't really acquainted with it and loving everything. I'm really, really glad to get to know you. I have a question that actually is a follow-up question, a more precise question based on what Daniel asked, because what I do think it's a bit overdetermined by European approach is that
Yes.
the place of the state, let's say, to be a bit, philosophical, there's a long tradition of associating being in history with being mediated by the state. For example, Hegelian approach. So there is an idea that mediation, dialectics, and so on in politics goes through the state. So I find it very interesting in the way you just mentioned that there is a bit of skepticism on your part on dismissing dialectics as such, because you're dismissing a state view, because that might be an overdetermined tradition from Europe, where those two things are more interlinked than places where there is a bargain that is not put on political movements in Europe, which is, if you want to be part of world history, you need to go through the state. That sort of colonial dynamic is not really something that political movements in Europe or America or other places necessarily deal with. They don't necessarily have clarity over the fact that autonomously organizing or organizing against the state is in a certain way moving a direction where it doesn't necessarily, let's say, equip you to enter the stage with other political movements in the world. So I wonder if this is relevant for you, let's say, this different bargain with regards to the state, where in other places, going against the state means to participate in history, revolutions, things like this. But in other places where the state of law, the classic liberal state and things like this, were always had a different role to play, to move against them doesn't mean the same thing, right? It has a different valency in society as well and in politics. I wonder if this might be a relevant point. I don't know what you think.
Okay. I'll try. I mean, let me try and let me try and make sense of what I think this question has with it. I mean, there is a sense in which Lazarus, and to a certain extent Badiou, are Eurocentric. And I don't want to insist too much on this because I don't think it's that fundamental. But there are certain Eurocentric, I mean, in Lazarus in particular, when he says that, politics was invented in ancient Greece is actually false. But that Eurocentricity is probably in some ways connected to thinking through the state. But what I find interesting in the way that at least maybe Badiou more than Lazarus argues is that from my experience on the African continent, the question was always, we have to attain state power. It was probably formulated most succinctly by Kwame Nkrumah. He says, how does he say? Seek ye first the political kingdom, and everything shall be given unto thee. So he uses a biblical formulation, which basically says, you have to gain control of state power. And all politics is about gaining control of state power. And what I have insisted on is that is the fundamental problem of, that has been the fundamental problem on the African continent. And that you can't think of politics outside the parameters of the state. So even the most progressive, you take people like Fanon or people like Cabral, there is an assumption that despite all their critical thinking, that the state is if you want to transform the world, you have to do it through the state. Now, the argument is not the argument. Mine, and certainly not Badiou's or Lazarus, is not an anarchist argument. It's not saying you must never consider the state. The question, I think, is, and I think maybe that's a cop-out, and I'm not too could be, but the idea is that the question of the state, whether in fact one should engage with various forms of state practices, is a question which is not how should I put it? Not a universal question. It is one which is ultimately determined by the specific circumstances. So if you think, for example, one is talking about a country like the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I've had many discussions with Wamba on this, where the state is not functioning, it's not providing, for example, electricity, clean water, or whatever the case may be, then there has to be a way in which you can argue for the existence of state provisioning without it necessarily collapsing into an idea that you have to take state power. You understand? So what I think I'm trying to say is that the question of the state is not one which is the be-all and end-all of all politics. It's ultimately a conjunctural question, and it's a question which has to be answered by the organization as to what should be done, and people need to sit down and discuss it. I mean, I could take the example also of Abahlali Basim Jondolo. I don't know if you've heard of them. It's an organization of shack dwellers in Durban, in South Africa, who have come up with very, very interesting political issues. But they have understood that, for example, voting doesn't work for them, because voting is simply about putting someone in power who will pursue his or her career. So that they said voting is not going to resolve our question. What is going to resolve our question is collective action of one form or another. And they can be quite radical, because they're actually arguing against private property in land, for example, which is quite amazing. I don't know how many organizations. I suppose if you look at Native American ones, they do the same thing. But this is actually in practice. They're going on occupying land and organizing it collectively in a way which is not private. So I don't know if that makes is that an accurate, that's a valid answer. But I mean, it's trying to struggle with this idea of any project which tries to have some idea of universality, which tries to think at a distance from the state. How is it to address state problems? And the answer is not a simple one. Yeah,
that's very helpful, and I think Lazarus invites us to read the historians Bloch and Finlay
yes,
because Finlay is the one who has this thesis on politics.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, two more quick questions. Can we keep it? We're going to transition to our next presenter in 5 minutes. So we have a question from Samuel. Go ahead, please.
Thanks very much. I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit more about the Haitian Revolution, because it provoked me to think a bit about CLR James and the kind of struggle over what Lazarus calls the mode of thought from the French Revolution. So I was just wondering if you had any comments on that kind of struggle over that mode of politics, essentially, that you could elaborate on.
Yes. I think the book to read on the Haitian Revolution is Caroline Fick. Have you come across that name? Caroline Fick, F-I-C-K. It's called, I think it's an absolutely brilliant book. I would recommend it. Here it is. It's called The Making of Haiti. Can you see that? The Making of Haiti, the Saint-Domingue Revolution from below. Now, she was a student of C.L.R. James's, and the main thesis of the book is that even the leaders, the Jacobins, the well-known leaders, especially Dessalines and them, but Toussaint is a slightly more difficult character, but they vacillated, and that sometimes they were with the French, sometimes with the English, sometimes they were royalists, sometimes they were republicans, and she's saying that fundamentally the core of the revolutionary movement was formed of slaves, and they're the ones who pushed their leaders along when the leaders were vacillating and not always deciding which way to go. So that the consistency in the struggle for freedom was pushed by the slaves. And interestingly enough, the literature points out the majority of these slaves were from Africa, from Congo, actually. 60% of the slaves in Haiti came from, well, because they died so young, they had to keep on re-importing newcomers. So they had experience of war already in the Congo. So what's fascinating about it is that it's not just simply the ideology of the French Revolution. That is the subjectivity which is dominant within the revolutionary forces of the ex-slaves, but also ideologies and subjectivities which come from Africa, and it's that combination of the two which makes that unique, including, of course, the Maroons, who are kind of guerrillas hiding up in the mountains and come down and raid and so on and so on. So it's fascinating. I would recommend this book. Okay, so you read that one and then you'll see. I mean, it's extremely good. So you can, and what I try to do then is use through this book to use Lazarus to work out various sequences in the Haitian Revolution.
Okay. Next question is from Duncan. Please go.
Oh, Drew is there.
Yeah. So I just wondered what, in particular, your thoughts. Like, what's the place for theory? If you take Lazarus seriously and take what he says, and do work in that vein, do you always end up sort of thinking about political events in this sort of traditional theoretical way after the fact? Do you become more than like a political theorist? Do you become a historian or something like that? That's the kind of question I'm interested in.
I think to answer that one, I have to talk about the dialectic, because I mean, have you heard of someone called Raya Dunayevskaya? Very interesting character. She was kind of Trotsky's secretary for a while, but she's written this book where she argues that.
Sorry, Michael. What's the name again?
Raya Dunayevskaya. Let me show you.
Dunayevskaya.
Here we go. I'm getting you books from my library, you see, then you can have a good look. Can you see this? Dunayevskaya.
Great.
Okay, so she's got quite a complex argument about the role of dialectics in political thought. But the idea is that fundamentally, that people themselves can actually create theory. They create theory through practice. And intellectuals get that practice and in a sense formalize it in a way that it becomes theoretical. But you can't think of theory and practice as two distinct things and as one kind of informing the other. And then I suppose in the more sophisticated versions, then the practice reacts back onto theory in the same way as people used to think the base superstructure model, the link between them, and this is the whole point of what she argues. This is actually at the core of Marxism, that there is this, that Marxist politics, I should say, that if you are to think politics, you have to be able to jointly think the kind of practice which people do in their struggles, and link that with your theoretical perspectives. So there has to be a kind of constant to and fro, which is, like, of course, an idea one finds in Mao as well. Okay, so it's not just theory on one hand and then whatever, you know? So it's pointless just being a theorist stuck in your office like I am here at the moment, if you if you want to think emancipatory politics. Yeah.
Very good. Well, I feel very bad having to stop, because this has been enriching and challenging, and really, I think, a nice massage to our brains, because this book has challenged us, and your talk, I think, has actually made things a lot more accessible. So we thank you for that, Michael, very much. You're more than welcome, Michael, to stay on. We have 3 quick interventions from different members of our team right now. I know it's late where you are. I believe it is, at least.
It's okay. It's 5 to 10. So I mean,
Sure.
I can stay. Yeah. No, I'll hang around. I saw that a friend of mine is keeps on coming in and going out. And so Dhruv Jain was there. So
you know Dhruv, yeah.
I know Dhruv. Yeah.
Yeah, Dhruv, you want to say hello?
Hi, Michael.
Hi, how are you doing? Oh, I can't hear you. But anyway.
Glad to hear your paper.
Okay.
Okay, so maybe, Michael, could people possibly like send you an email if they had any?
Of course.
Is that okay?
Yeah,
Yep.
perfect. Perfectly okay.
Okay.
Perfectly okay.
So I think some will do that. I'll share the email with them. And again, we're very, very honored to sort of have your presence and your insights. So
Thank you very much. Very kind of you.
very nice.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Virtual round of applause.
Virtual.
All right. Again, apologies. We cannot continue this very rich dialogue. Okay. Let us now move on to Robyn. And Robyn has an intervention, which I think is, I'm very much looking forward to, in part for both the critical dimension of, I think, what Robyn will give us, but also Robyn is a very good reader in philosophy of Hegel, and so I'm very excited to see Robyn's views on Lazarus. So Robyn, please take it away.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here, to participate in this discussion. These Saturdays have been wonderful for me, and I've learned so much from all of you, so thank you. I also want to apologize in advance for perhaps the overly critical sort of tone in my remarks. For the most part, I'm dazzled by this work, and I'm sort of dazzled by Lazarus's thinking broadly. And yet I'm not going to focus so much on those aspects, and try to, so that this is not simply a Lazarus admiration society. I will try to raise some questions, some more critical questions that I have. I want to begin by pursuing the line of thought that I raised in our last session. That as I read it, the anthropology of the name, Lazarus's anthropology of the name, must be taken as the repudiation of the philosophy of the concept. That the anthropology of the name has as its sort of implicit or secret polemical object something that I might call the philosophy of the concept. And this strikes me then as a profound challenge to the entire tradition that has been called Western Marxism, mostly by its enemies, a tradition that revolves and coheres, as I understand it, around the primacy of the concept, perhaps even more than a theory of culture, right? The primacy of the concept as a project that joins thinkers as different as Adorno and the Frankfurt School with Althusser. We spoke last week of Lazarus's relationship to Marx, right? I'm thinking about Drew's provocative claim that Lazarus has nothing to do with Marx ultimately, right? But I think actually making sense of his anthropology of the name requires that we hold on to the kernel of truth that he retains from Marx, right? Despite the lapsing of the historical mode that closes around the proper name of Marx, that kernel of truth being the insight he finds in Marx that politics is thinkable only in its distinction and separation from philosophy. Names, here I'm quoting Lazarus on 101, quote, names are distinct. What one name covers cannot be shared with what is covered by another name. Concepts can be exported, not names. Right, so names for Lazarus are the producer of polysemy, the homogeneous multiplicity, and the heterogeneous singularity of a mode of politics. The anthropology of the name, Lazarus says, quote, does not set out to constitute or identify names, but instead identify the place of the name that leads not to the name itself, but to the mode of politics, right? So in other words, not the who of politics, not the who of the name, but the from where, right? This from where defined in its singularity, its sequentiality, and its rarity. I want us to consider Lazarus's discussion of the name in light of Althusser's rightly celebrated concept of ideology. In elaborating the mechanisms of interpolation, you will all remember this quote from Althusser that I'm going to force you to suffer through right now. Quote, that an individual is always already a subject even before he is born, is nevertheless the plain reality accessible to everyone and not a paradox at all. Freud shows that individuals are always abstract with respect to the subjects they always already are, simply by noting the ideological ritual that surrounds the expectation of a birth, that happy event. Everyone knows how much and in what way an unborn child is expected, right? Which amounts to saying very prosaically, if we agree to drop the sentiments, i.e. the forms of family, ideology, paternal, maternal, conjugal, fraternal, in which the unborn child is expected. It is certain, Althusser writes, in advance that it will bear its father's name and therefore have an identity and be irreplaceable. Before its birth, the child is therefore always already a subject, appointed as a subject in and by the specific familial ideological configuration in which it is expected once it has been conceived. I hardly need to add that this familial ideological configuration is, in its uniqueness, highly structured. Note for Althusser that the name in its subjectivating singularity is also bound to a power that is inherited and assigned. The proper name, after all, is the name of the Father, both uniquely and irreplaceably mine, but also given to me before I was even born. And I think there is a profound feminist argument buried in this Marxist, Freudian, Lacanian theory of ideology, one that is entirely abandoned in Lazarus's anthropology of the name. And indeed, I would suggest that it is Lazarus's androcentrism which undergirds his anthropology, and which also allows him to move all too abruptly past the politics of feminism and the mode of thinkability opened up in the event of feminist politics, but also what permits him to discount any mode of politics that cannot be organized around a proper name. And he, after all, provides us with our non-exhaustive but still revealing list of proper names. Dare I say, our fathers: Saint-Just, Robespierre, Marx, Lenin, Mao. The factory is a place of politics, but not the household or the family. The proper name, indeed the name of the father, risks a politics only thinkable, I think, in terms of leaders and leadership, in terms of authorities and authorship, and alas, despite every explicit intention in the book, a lingering epistemological statism. Let me say something else about politics defined in its rarity, whether or not we take that to mean infrequency or something else. It is an approach to politics as eventimentality, right? Of course, not a theological approach to politics, right? The event as some kind of miracle, but of course, I think we can also see the confusion as the primacy of the event assumes there is politics only with the inauguration of something new. Politics defined in its radical singularity, politics as singular with respect to philosophy, history, economics. And here I think we might note Lazarus's very interesting departure from someone like Rancière, although I think Drew is quite right to note that both Lazarus and Rancière move away from Althusser along the same line of thought, right? Namely, the thought that people think, and that a worker's anthropology is the verification of this statement. Or, as Rancière ventriloquizes the ignorant schoolmaster, quote, "Our problem isn't proving that intelligence is equal, it is seeing what can be done under that supposition." We find this emphasis on the doing, right? What Rancière will describe as the artisanal nature of all intelligence, also I think expressed in Lazarus, in his view of thinking as doing, in his rejection of the classic antinomy of theory and practice, which precisely excludes an idea of thinking as doing. But I want to note what I see as a subtle point of disagreement between Lazarus and Rancière, with profound implications for an understanding of politics. For Rancière, the statement "people think" is joined to a second and equally important statement, that everything is in everything. And it is this second statement which I think precisely excludes the second statement found in Lazarus, quote, "Thought is a relationship of the real," when the real is defined in terms of its mode, right, and arguably bound to its historical mode. Everything is in everything, which for Rancière undergirds a universal theory of language as translation, an argument for the absolute relatability of all things to other things, is, I think, a statement contradicted by the radical singularity of politics in Lazarus. It is as if we are not permitted to relate one mode to another, as if we're never permitted to become translators ourselves, to relate one thing that we know to another thing that we know, and to see everything in everything else. For Rancière, this statement, "everything is in everything," a postulate of the intelligence, if you will, is verification of the absolute equality in all human intelligence and the absolute relatability of all things to all other things. It is, I think, the insight that allows Rancière to avoid the pitfalls of periodization with which Lazarus's anthropology never really breaks. Although I do believe that his method of saturation is among the most interesting and promising efforts to rethink historical modes beyond periodization. Still, that everything is in everything is at the heart of Rancière's theory of writing, his deference to the quote, dead letter of the book over the living language of the speaking subject. And this brings me finally to the concept of consciousness. For we will recall that Rancière's definition of emancipation is the becoming conscious of this equality in nature, this absolute equality in nature. Now, Lazarus says that the concept of consciousness is unusable. And this, interestingly, emerges from his own exercise in self-criticism, his reappraisal of his earlier reading of Lenin, who he once believed offered a theory of consciousness in its separability from the theory of the party. That the Leninist theory of consciousness he once thought was its real theory of politics, right? A view that his sort of revised theory of modes now rules out. We might relate this argument about consciousness, that it is unusable for a concept of politics, or rather that consciousness will always bring us back to a concept of politics rather than the unnameable name of politics. We might relate this argument about consciousness to the question concerning feminism and feminist politics, right, which had once seen consciousness raising at its heart and also rallied around the statement that Asad brought up last week, quote, the personal is political. We might conclude that consciousness, right, is its own mode, right, that has perhaps lapsed, right? But we also might think about consciousness as a certain kind of translation of earlier formulas, right? Enlightenment, perhaps, which gets translated in new terms, like woke, perhaps. I'm not quite ready to give up consciousness, call it my Leninist Lukácsian conceit, but also because I think that it ultimately will require that we give up the unconscious and call that my Freudian Lacanian conceit. And I'm most certainly unwilling to abandon this admittedly unfashionable idea of the unconscious, and even the reconstruction of a political unconscious. An analysis of contemporary politics, in particular the seductions of a statist form of politics from right to left, cannot do without this term, unconscious, in my view. I am myself seduced by Lazarus's effort to think politics radically apart from statism, radically apart from the implicit statism of the Marxist and Leninist modes and the explicit statism that constitutes the parliamentary mode. But I worry about how the anthropology of the name disavows its own reliance on the law of the father, and how, as a result, it prohibits a concept of emancipation from this law. Finally, I want to say something about the point that Professor Neocosmos raised in his remarks, that politics is thought, which is to say that politics is not about power, right? Neither the power of classes over other classes, nor the experience of shared power that a theorist like Sheldon Wolin defines as democracy. There's that remarkable, but in my view, very elliptical note in the introduction when Lazarus says that he is not unfamiliar with the name of Foucault, right? Which I think is him telling us something about a kind of decentering of power in an anthropology of the name. But thinking about Lazarus's relationship to somebody like Wolin, right? Wolin too regarded politics in its democratic mode as episodic and rare, right? What he described as fugitive democracy. But his was a concept of politics built on shared power, on sharing of power and sharing of resources. Wolin too argued for thinking democracy not as a form of the state, but as a mode of being, or we might say with Lazarus, as a mode of thinking as doing. For myself, I'm interested in this retreat from power as the site of a distinctly political relation, both for how it marginalizes a revolt against the state, general strike, the politics of the riot, but also for how it rules out a potential concept of democracy as shared power. Thank you.
Bravo, beautiful. Robyn, that was frankly electrifying. So really, really honored to have those comments. We have time for one, maybe two questions.
Sorry if I went on too long. I'm sorry.
No. It's my fault. I've been very generous, but that's okay. Let's hear it. Jump in, people. Jump in, as you wish. I think you've left us with so many threads, but perhaps there's a nugget that somebody wishes to latch onto and offer a response to. Feel free.
Yeah, I have a question. No, I actually just wanted to hear you speak a bit more about something you said that I have an intuitive agreement with, but I don't know how to work through it, which is you mentioned that you think the method of saturation is very interesting, but you think it's kind of decoupled from actually the periodization, the whole approach, right? So could you perhaps elaborate a bit more?
Yeah, so, you know, for me, one of the things that I was thinking about, and one of the things that has come up every week in our discussion is the relationship of this sort of theory or account of modes as it relates to a kind of earlier notion of the kind of periodicity of politics or efforts at periodization. And it seems to me, as I try to decipher what the method of saturation is as it relates to the mode, says something actually quite interesting about how sort of modes like leave their residue, right? And so that even as he's inclined to think in terms of the sort of the boundedness and the closed circle of the mode, right, which can only appear in itself in its in a kind of external appraisal of the thing, that he also has this notion of saturation and a method of saturation, which in my view really interestingly sort of presses against what he wants to tell us about the sort of the singularity of modes. So I wanted to leave open the possibility that the method of saturation as a method actually undoes the singularity of and the boundedness and the sort of almost closed circle of a given mode of politics, so that the method of saturation interestingly gets modes outside of the problematic of periods. I wanted to like hold on to that possibility, but I also wanted to, I think, ultimately side with that nugget of insight that I'm drawing out of Rancière, the sort of argument that everything is in everything, which I think in some sense more fully and more polemically resists that impulse toward singularity, right? So I was totally with Drew when he said, like, you know, really when we think about this kind of post-Althusserian problematic, we have Lazarus and Rancière very interestingly echoing one another. And I think that for the most part, that's absolutely right. I was completely persuaded by that. But then there's like this thing, which is the statement, everything is in everything, which you could say is Rancière's second statement that runs parallel, but I think in a very different direction from Lazarus's second statement, right? Which is the statement that opens to the specific theory of the mode. So I want to suggest that, like, thinking about mode and method critically and in their potential collision with one another in Rancière is like currently where my thinking is and what I'm most interested in. But before I work that out, I would also just want to flag how very different it seems on my reading from the argument for a kind of universal translation that we get in Rancière. Does that help a little?
Okay, Robyn, thank you. And I just want to be generous to people. I want to be able to break it at 6 p.m. Eastern. And in order to do that, we need to stick to schedule. So let us hear from Asad Haider. He has a brief intervention picking up on his original article called Socialists Think, which is actually the title of our wider project here. So Asad, please take it away.
Okay, I will be very brief and also informal. I will get to my own article and explain a little bit about the interest in Lazarus and the reasons for turning towards his ideas. I want to just sort of speculatively talk about what's happening right now also, because it's something that, as we're talking about this theory of politics here, and we're observing various political processes happening in a very unusual and confusing context. I think there's something very important here about considering the relationship between the social and politics, not precisely the political, because, this going to Badiou's distinction, can politics be thought, the political would be at the level of institutions rather than at the level of political events. So I think there are a lot of challenges now in thinking about the relationship between the social and politics. I think we have, in many cases, social categories, social elements, which we're not able to clearly interpret politically. We don't know whether they constitute political categories. Now, in a general sense, let me say, first of all, I think that and this follows on many arguments in Lazarus, that I think the sociological category of the working class is a very troublesome category. We find, I think, that it does not correspond to forms of consciousness, let's say, to recall this category under erasure that we're using, or to forms of political action. And I think, it exists as an abstraction at the level of the social, but not at the level of politics. And I think that we instead are forced to think in terms of what I'll just speculatively call some popular elements, which, here today we hear them described in terms of categories like essential workers or the unemployed, or more broadly the poor, or even under the social categorization of racialized populations. These are different ways of identifying the popular elements that we see today. Now, in the United States, we had just recently, before the pandemic, and let me say that the pandemic, I think, once again, as we're thinking about a critique of the social, the pandemic with social distancing also represents the potential for social disintegration. And so the social categories that we have been employing have the potential to splinter even further. But before the pandemic, we had in the United States the unprecedented electoral success and then defeat of the Bernie Sanders campaign. Now, this represents a certain tendency that we can align with the left in our understanding. And here there's the problematic category of socialism, which of course in translation from the French context to the American context is very confusing. And this is why in some ways to use the term socialist to talk about Lazarus is odd, because socialism represents a position internal to the state in France. Here it certainly does not. But with the Bernie Sanders campaign, we saw an attempt to integrate socialism into the state. That is to make socialism present as a category internal to the state. And it was at the social level embedded in a kind of intellectual bureaucratic layer of the US population. Now, this is a kind of social democratic left that existed before, and which I think constitutes a social category whose political status is unclear. What we're seeing now, today, in the past couple days, is a mobilization of the popular elements, defined not in terms of the sociological category of class, but in terms of other categories, in a direct antagonism towards the state. And so we see a potentially political status of the mobilization of the popular elements, which is not aligned with the programmatic and organizational form of the left that we have seen slowly coalescing. And this non-alignment, to me, poses very interesting and challenging questions to think through. Because we have, on the one hand, the potential of the depoliticizing integration of a left program, a left political program into the state. And then on the other hand, we have direct antagonism to the state, which is independent of an organizational form associated with a political program. Now, of course, this is very schematic because we will find various concrete convergences and intersections. But at a schematic level, I'm just trying to think through this potential non-alignment between the political program and the popular mobilization. And one of the fundamental points in Lazarus's thought is that the social is not a foundation for politics. There is no direct expression between social categories and emancipatory politics. And now I think that the context of social disintegration puts an even greater pressure on this problem, on this question. And I don't have an answer to that, but I want to point to it. I want to gesture to it. Okay, these are my scattered reflections on the present that were keeping me up last night. For late into the morning. Okay, so now to move directly to the story with Lazarus. You know, I had been working with Viewpoint on the history of workers' inquiry, which we had associated first and foremost with the tradition of Italian workerism. And we did a lot of work on trying to dig up that history, look at what it meant theoretically. A fundamentally important aspect was, in fact, the critique of consciousness, or the category of class consciousness, as a means of understanding class. And it was replaced by the category of class composition, which at its most schematic level meant understanding the technical formation of the working class in determinate processes of production, and then on the other hand, of the determinate forms of organization, which were asserted by the working class in its movements. Now, here we had a kind of dialectic of the social and politics, the social and perhaps the political, which was that there was constantly an idea that the technical composition of the working class yielded particular forms of political composition, and that you could periodize them historically and find the hegemonic forms of class composition that represented a particular stage of capitalist development. Now, this theory, was extremely suggestive as a way of trying to understand the specificity and the material existence of class. Class not as an abstraction which would be applied transhistorically, and not as a form of consciousness, but in terms of these forms of composition. But it turned out to be very unsatisfactory, that you would end up identifying these hegemonic figures in a kind of linear periodization. You would not account for the fact, for example, that in the period when, at the beginning of capitalist development, when the industrial worker was supposedly the hegemonic figure of the working class, the vast majority of labor and performed in the capitalist world market is done by slaves in plantations. That's just, you know, the most striking and original example of the problem with that kind of thing. But, you know, I wanted still to maintain this method, which was the questioning of consciousness. And so a little bit later, after the work on Italian workerism, some of the self-critical reflections on that problematic, I discovered Lazarus's text on workers' anthropology and factory inquiry, which we translated for a viewpoint and which was the basis of thinking of this article. Now I'll say at the same time, in parallel, my own theoretical formation was fundamentally grounded in Althusser, and there was here a different critique of the category of consciousness, which Robyn has alluded to somewhat. And this was the critique which sees consciousness as an effect of the structure, let's say, and the subject as an effect of the structure. And this basic move of theoretical anti-humanism is a fundamentally important critique of Western Marxism and of the various forms of, let's say, empiricist and, you know, the kind of tie that Althusser describes between empiricism and the speculative mode of thought that is so often assumed, once again, by the discourse today on class consciousness, which is that a common socialist position today in the socialist sort of renaissance of the United States is that the sociological category of the working class will ultimately express itself in a class consciousness. And that presumably there's some set of barriers to making that happen, but that the linear expression of the sociological category in consciousness will ultimately take place, and that will be the basis for a socialist politics. Organization and so on is either seen as a kind of transhistorical invariant, that, you know, organization is something that just takes particular forms at any point, or it's totally subordinated to the consciousness, to class consciousness. That is, that class consciousness will just automatically result in forms of organization that will realize a socialist political program. So the Althusserian anti-humanist critique was very important in demonstrating that consciousness is an effect of the structure, and the subject is formed in subjection to a power. That is, the consciousness that we can identify is constituted in subordination to power, and so we cannot speak of this, and this is the problem of ideology, of course, and so we cannot speak of any kind of direct expression of a sociological category in an antagonistic consciousness, because consciousness is understood first and foremost as the formation of the subject in subjection. The power of this critique is very great, but it establishes a clear problem for emancipatory politics, which is a great aporia on Althusser's thought. And, you know, we can point to the great expert on Althusser's thought on Machiavelli. Drew here has written a great text on this, but Machiavelli appears to be the only place, this sort of isolated place in Althusser's body of work, which actually addresses the question of historical political agency. Otherwise, it is an unthinkable category in Althusser. And this is where Badiou is a singular figure in the post-Althusserian tradition for trying to articulate a theory of the subject which comes after theoretical anti-humanism and does not resort back to previous conceptions of the subject. And so this is the other kind of line of thinking that I was taking as I approached Lazarus. And already I've gone on a lot, and so I said I would be brief, and I want to be, I want to follow through on that. So I just already pointed to some of the criticisms I had of the existing socialist modes of thought that are arising right now. And it was manifested for me in a classic line, a classic sentence that we began to see everywhere in the popularization of contemporary Marxism and socialism, which was, socialists think that X. And you know, you can see right away, you can see right away the sense in which Lazarus presents a criticism of this sentence structure, which is that thought is referred to an object right off the bat, that there is a doctrine which already exists and is out there and is fully formed, and we can allude to it and say that this is what socialists think. Socialists think that, you know, socialists think that racism can only be resolved through the class struggle. For example, this is a classic sentence that we see. And so this is a good example for me to present, because it raises two of the ways in which I thought that Lazarus's thought was fundamentally important. One was that he wants to prevent us from shifting into the object, to the objectal mode of thinking, and place the emphasis on thought. And so this is why I truncated the sentence structure to socialists think rather than socialists think that, because we want to investigate, when we are trying to identify political processes, thought which cannot immediately be referred to an object, and in this case referred to a doctrine. Now, second, this question of race and class was, you know, I think one that frequently came up as a problem in the debates around socialist theory. And I wrote a book about race and class, and I wrote a book which was nominally about race and class. I told Verso, whatever subtitle will sell is good, it's fine. You know, and then of course there were criticisms from two different directions. One criticism saying, well, he's a Marxist who wants to subordinate race to class. They always do that. This reading had nothing to do with my text. It was a non-reading, because this was not my argument. But the second argument, which came up in a surprising way, because I expected the first criticism, but the second criticism, which was so surprising, was one which was also based on a non-reading, but it was one which said, he presents no real theory of class. He's abandoned class as the central category of Marxist thought. And so he has no real account of the relation between race and class. And then as I reflected on the book and I began to engage in debates and so on, I realized there was more truth in the second accusation, which is that in the book, I barely talk about class. I don't present a theory of class. And because the book is not about the sociological relationship between race and class. That is not the theory I was presenting, but intuitively, I was trying to present a theory of emancipatory politics in which both race and class could be categories. That is, the anti-racist struggles. There was, let's say, the first intuition which came from that initial problematic of class composition, which incorporated the anti-historicist critique of class composition by referring back to the foundation of capitalist development in racial slavery. That initial very powerful critique was very much on my mind. And I had one intuition, which I later, I'm engaging in a self-criticism of it, which was that by demonstrating the relationship the fundamental mutually constitutive relationship of race and class composition, we could demonstrate the emancipatory character of struggles against racism because they were also class struggles. This was one intuition that I had because it was clear to me that the anti-racist struggles were emancipatory in content, but I was within the problematic which said that they had to be related to class. I came to realize that this problematic has to be abandoned, that in fact, the emancipatory character of anti-racist struggles is a political interpretation. That is, it is only from the vantage point of emancipatory politics, which does not rest on the sociological foundation, that we can identify the emancipatory character of these struggles. And thus both struggles against racism and class struggles belong to emancipatory politics, but not because of an intrinsic sociological foundation. Rather, from the vantage point of emancipatory politics considered in itself, in interiority or in subjectivity, as Lazarus would have. I've spoken enough and I'll stop.
Thanks, Asad. That was fabulous. Thank you for your extemporaneous reflections and bringing us into the present. I think that's really lightens our load. And I want to invite a couple comments from whoever would like to intervene. Let's jump in. I know we have Michael Neocosmos still with us. Thank you for, it must be quite late where you are, Michael.
I have a question for Asad.
Go ahead, Dhruv.
Yeah, so Asad, I mean, and this is something that both you and Robyn both pointed to, right? And then that is the question of periodization and saturation. Now, if you adopt a orthodox Lazarusian position, one could say that your book is a symptom of a saturation of class and a new category, a series of subjective categories around race, right? And then one can get into the whole sort of world of subcategories of subjectivities within identity politics, right? Trans, LGBTQ, two-spirited, and then all the other gradations and differentiations. So we have a saturation of class politics. I was wondering if that for you, or for both you, Robyn, and you, if you find that to be is that a limit then of periodization and the absolutization of saturation? So rather than thinking the possibility of both race and class, one is forced into class as a saturated series of categories, and then in the American politic, it is now race that has become the subjective categories that we now need to engage in political thought, thinking of politics through.
Okay, this is a very important question. And I have, it's important to me to understand, I think, the specificity of what Lazarus is doing with historical modes of politics. Because I think we have to distinguish between two ways of periodizing. The first form of periodization, which would be, let's say, the historicist form, would be to identify periods in the dialectic, in the historical dialectic. So moments in the unfolding of the totality. I do not think that this is Lazarus's form of periodization, and it's one which is, this is the other fundamental critique of Althusser. This is why Althusser was important in criticizing that class composition problematic, which saw this historical dialectic. I think that Lazarus's periodization is tied instead to sequentiality. That is, that we are not identifying moments in the unfolding of the totality, but discrete sequences which began and ended, which makes no claim to having an absolute status. You know, this is not, it's not a Hegelian enterprise in this sense. There's no reason why we have to read Lazarus on these historical modes of politics and say that these were the only ones. This is why Michael's book identifies different historical modes of politics outside of Europe, and it's I think totally consistent with Lazarus's undertaking to do this. And so that's what I would say about periodization. And I think that the question you raise about race and class, I mean, I think we wouldn't, I'm wondering to what extent your question is based on a framing which would be of the other kind of periodization, if we were to put it this way. Because rather, if we think in terms of sequentiality, we can't say that either that these categories correspond to historical periods. So the saturation of class, I mean, Lazarus identifies the saturation of class with 1871. So, it's like we already had to think past that. Yeah.
Can I say a few words?
Please.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in the real problem that you raise for politics and for Marxism, which is basically the link between the social categories, whichever they happen to be, class, race, whatever, gender, whichever ones you happen to be thinking about, and political subjectivity. And what we're battling with is this idea of does consciousness or does political subjectivity reflect or represent in one way or other what the categories that are already there. And for me, I find that has been one of the problems in at least the way Marxism has been thought of traditionally, that in order to get over this issue, we need to think in terms of a dialectic. I don't mean a historical dialectic a la Hegel. I mean more of a dialectic in the way Badiou uses the term, for example, the immanent exception. If you think in terms of the fact that we always live within a place. We all exist within the social. Whether we like it or not, we're always within the social. But we have the capacity to think, as Lazarus says quite clearly. In other words, we don't have to remain within the social. We don't have to simply have a form of subjectivity which is an interest-bearing subjectivity. It can be, disinterested interest, to use Badiou's term. So I think especially during periods of mass popular upsurge, you can actually see a clear distinction between, if you want to say, the politics of interest and the politics of something else. Something that we call emancipation, and which has, in one way or another, some form of universality attached to it. And it's that contradiction which I think explains the idea of saturation. That it's that contradiction, that dialectical contradiction, which explains why, to my mind, why various sequences come to an end. Otherwise, you don't know why they come to an end. You say it's saturated, okay, well, it's saturated, but it doesn't exist anymore. But why? And I think that it's the existence of that particular dialectic which I think enables us to understand the limited nature of emancipatory politics. So we can't. You are right when you say, it's the subjectivities of race and class, because people are oppressed. Racism is oppressive, and therefore they react to that oppression from that particular position. But if you stay within that particular position, then you become something which you guys in America call Afro-pessimists. You remain within there, and then that can lead to fascism very, very easily, because ultimately your position is one which is saying, our interests as an identity can only be emancipated in inverted commas if we smash other people. So ultimately your interests are satisfied solely through oppressing others. And it's only if you have some idea that goes beyond that, in other words, some form of universality, that you can exceed that, and then you could, that's why you have that dialectic. Otherwise you remain within place, you remain within the social. You have to exceed it in one way or another. And that's why I think you're absolutely right the way you formulated it, you know. So it can be class, but I mean, you know, I've always found it very problematic the way the term the working class has been, as if it's on an already constituted political entity, you know. I mean, the whole point about is that politically that working class has to be constituted. It just doesn't. It might exist sociologically, but I mean, that doesn't really mean very much. You know, it just tells you that people are oppressed and smashed and whatever. But they don't necessarily react in that way. They don't necessarily react in a socialist or a progressive way. You know, they could go in all sorts of directions. So I think the way to get round this issue is to try and develop a dialectic. And I think in that sense, I think Badiou is more helpful because he's got this notion of the immanent exception, which I think can be extended and developed in one form.
Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, since Gabriel's presentation a few sessions ago, I've been thinking about one thing that he said as kind of an aside, and it was from the Workers Think statement, a reflection on the literature, you know, this great literature that we have around neoliberalism, you know, which is really a kind of Foucauldian foreclosure of the capacity for thinking or the capacity for, you know, subjectivity in the current period. And Gabriel suggested at that time that Lazarus presented a kind of an antidote to that or another way forward from that. And that was sort of what I was grasping in an inchoate way about the usefulness of the text myself. And I think and even though the language I speak is mostly a Hegelian one, it's mostly a dialectical one, but I've been, you know, there are ways in which the consummate negativity that has produced and that amplifies itself, I think gives to that tradition of thought certain limitations, especially in the current moment. And I think that Asad also points towards, you know, from the starting point of Lazarus, from the without object, from a kind of, I think, a new approach to subjectivity or thinking of subjectivity. I think the project points to certain possibilities. And so it's a question, you know, that anyone could maybe respond to. And I mean, I think that you know, one problem I have with Lazarus is that it's a kind of, and it's not a problem with Lazarus. I mean, one place I'd like to push is that the knowledge that is produced in the sequence, in the saturation of the sequence, will be a knowledge of that mode. I mean, of a mode that has been saturated, and therefore I think it's difficult for me anyway to kind of think the category of the emancipatory as Asad is suggesting that maybe we can do. I mean, I think Lazarus is very useful on the state, and I think he gives ways of thinking outside the state, the necessity of thinking outside the state. I think he has new approaches to that are useful, but the particular politics of emancipation, I don't know. But I do think, I don't know if Gabriel, if you want to return to that, or if that was just an aside that you know, that wasn't central to your presentation, but I've been thinking about that since you said it, and, you know, in the context of kind of making use of Lazarus, as I think several people are trying to do.
So my point, I'll try to refer to what you're saying in my presentation a bit later on. So
okay. there might be other questions, but let me invite Asad or Robyn to respond to anything that's been said so far, and then we'll move on to our next presentation.
Robyn, do you want to say something?
No, I'm happy to leave the floor.
Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, I think Michael raised already some of the points that are an answer to what you were raising, Chris, in this, because Michael emphasizes people think means people can think in excess of the situation. And so there's, you know, in his book, the dialectic of the expressive and the excessive, what expresses the social and what is in excess of it. And I think, you know, that's important. I think that the question of emancipation, this is underdeveloped, and it's extremely difficult because, you know, it's another version of the difficult theoretical problem that is posed by singularity, the unnameable name, and the fact that for Lazarus there's no politics in general. So politics only exists in these specific historical modes. And so you have to, and yet we, in some sense, are speaking of it generally by identifying it in all of these different places and all of these different instances. And the problem with emancipation, I think it goes back, and Michael was talking about this, it also goes back to the Althusserian conception of subjection, which is that emancipation is being set free from a power. And so the first fact that emancipation begins from is the fact of oppression, of domination. Mm-hmm. And yet the conception of emancipatory politics, Lazarus, Badiou, and so on, are advancing as one which emancipation must be thought in itself. Political subject must be thought in itself. And so you have the problem of an emancipatory political subject always has to refer to it, the fact that it is dominated, and yet has to refer to itself in order to be conceived of as emancipatory. And this is, I think, another great theoretical problem that I can only allude to. I don't have a solution.
All right. Wonderful. This has been quite the session. I think our stamina may be tested. We have 2 more talks, my own and then Gabriel's. So thank you all for sticking with it. What is really a breathtaking conclusion to our activity. Before I give my talk, let me just say, because I want to cede as much time to Gabriel's case study as I can. We want to meet one more time. I'll send that in an email, maybe on a weeknight, to discuss the studies chapter where he discusses the French Revolution and the Canton worker example. So we want to do that just to sort of officially finish. So the title of my intervention is 3 Theses of Saturation, an investigation of method in Lazarus's thought. So I'm just going to read this, and I think it's been interesting that folks have found saturation to be maybe the least, or maybe the most helpful method that Lazarus gives to us. And I too have found it quite interesting. So these theses could also be considered problematics, or aspects of the method of saturation which I perceive as maybe undone in some way. So first of all, I want to start off with some clarificatory background on saturation for review. So saturation, Lazarus applies to 2 types of modes of politics. Number 1, the mode of politics where there is thought, or a mode of interiority of politics. What is also known as, let's call it, prescriptive politics, or a politics of subtraction at a distance from the state. Saturation is also applied to a mode of a historical relation of politics to thought. That is, saturation is a historical method of analyzing the breaks and ruptures from different modes, say the revolutionary to the Bolshevik mode, or the emergence of new modes such as the parliamentary mode. So there's this sort of local and historical dimension. As a method, saturation seeks to determine the lapsing of a mode or a category within a sequence for a new conjecture. That's key. On page 25, he notes this. There is thus a connection between modes, and the method of saturation maintains this connection between and across modes, as well as between politics and history, the local situation to its time and to the historical period. So there is always this connectivity. It's not a teleological connectivity, but it is some type of, let's call it post-structuralist telos. We must think of saturation along these two axes, what we might call the local and the historical, for sake of simplifying. I believe that saturation therefore implies an epistemological operation. That is, it implies an investigation into a potential breakdown in knowledge. Given that a politics in interiority is marked by a collapse of knowledge within a situation, saturation looks for a detethering of a people's thought to an objectal referent. Saturation takes place both in the thought, in the effectiveness of the mode, and in the thought of the mode having ceased. So you see, it presents a spectrum. It's not just cease, it's also effectiveness. It analyzes the efficacious and the non-efficacious aspect of emancipatory politics. The latter form of saturation, of the mode having ceased, is the one that has gripped our group since our first session. That is, we have been interested in the question of how a mode has ceased, what mode we are in, and how we might perform an epistemological analysis of our present, for which I think Asad's remarks and Robyn's and Gabriel's and others are helpful guideposts. This aspect of saturation has gripped us in part because Lazarus's principle that politics is, quote, rare and sequential implies that politics in our time is somehow negatively saturated. We have not been able to identify thought in the effectiveness of the mode, nor have we agreed on a mode in the first place. Lazarus in this text simply says we are subjected to the parliamentary mode, and he gives, I think, an account of a statist critique, which is very total. It is almost as if the Polish solidarity worker revolts of the early 80s that brought the Leninist mode to a point of completion or complete saturation or complete ceasing remains the endpoint of the last mode that is worth any novelty to speak of. We are thus in a time in which interiority processes have yet to produce sites. And here I'm referencing the distinction between place and site. They have yet to extend their saturation, because remember, saturation is also effectiveness, yeah, to the generation of new sites of politics. This is why I agree with Lazarus that our current political and historical conjecture is one in which we have to arrive at what he calls a taking place of a mode. And this requires an investigation of places. And for him, that's worker factories. Although that can be extended to other arenas of political contestation, such as the riots which are happening before our very eyes in the United States. A worker's anthropology must begin with the location of the real and the linkage of statement 1 to statement 2, and the identification of a new process of interiority. Now, the emergence of this point of the real within a place is given by an investigation, not of the place, not of the mode. So you see this local is privileged over this kind of abstract historical, which makes the anthropology of the name a very practical resource. We as militants must investigate the there is, and the real is the there is within an emergent local situation. Now, let me get to my three theses. These are, I guess you could say, incisive aspects, or what I find incisive, but also maybe left undone with the notion of saturation. Number one, saturation comes at the exhausted point of a sequence of politics. But unlike Hegel's owl of Minerva that only takes flight at dusk in order to loop back into the dialectical process, saturation marks a de-dialectization. That is, thinking without the totality. There is no synthesis in saturation. Saturation is an initiation of a thinking process of politics that means, quote, thinking without a composite totality. And that requires operating a radical change in prescription. A politics in interiority, such as we find in the revolutionary mode of Saint-Just and the French Revolution, occurred at the point of an exhaustion. You'll remember in the French Revolution section, he mentions this quite a lot. I think that's actually quite important, the thesis of exhaustion, not end, but exhaustion. Since for Lazarus, politics is of the order of thought, and thought comes at this point of exhaustion, politics starts with the decision of thought of people think, but the novelty of what is produced in a political sequence emerges at the point of exhaustion of a procedure. Thesis 2, exhaustion of a saturated mode implies an ethics. Although he does not elaborate an ethics of interiority, because one cannot have an ethics to interiority, one can have an ethics of interiority, it is clear that an ethics is implicit in Lazarus's thought. I locate this ethics in the following claim: the subjective leads to the subjective in thought. Therefore, saturation identifies this extra subjective emergence, a theme that is evident in Lazarus's treatment of the category of time as a subjective but negative, non-objective category. Does one need to be in interiority to think saturation? Is the anthropologist also in interiority? Lazarus writes, quote, to think without a composite totality requires operating a radical change in prescription. So you see that prescription is an ethics because it requires a certain strength of the group in question not to get caught back up in the totality. There is an implied ethics in saturation because in order to remain in interiority, there must be a principle that exceeds thought, but which keeps thought tethered to thought and not to the objectal. This is clear in the relation between naming and sight. If, as Lazarus writes, quote, the sight is a sight of the name and not a tool of history, Stalinism, what keeps a militant collective or a set of workers from keeping the unnameable unnamed? There must be a theory of strength and even, dare I say, of virtue that emerges at the subjective level if we wish to talk about the continuance or the perseverance of a politics in interiority. One would obviously be drawn to think, well, Badiou elaborates this ethics, so we can turn to him. Badiou has written, quote, every subject persists insofar as it resists its own conversion into an object. Every subject persists insofar as it resists its conversion into an object. This, I think, is the ethical maxim of what I might call persistence, which is at the core of Lazarus's ethical implied ethics. But perhaps this virtue is not fidelity, which Badiou obviously develops. I would rather say it is something like a virtue of persistence without knowledge. It's an unnamed virtue. It's a project that should be developed precisely. Something that maybe even goes back to theory of the subject and the combination of courage and justice. Okay, my final thesis on saturation, number 3, is the method of saturation is a method of separation, because a politics in interiority is non-objectal and persists without a referent. Separation is necessary in order to establish a site of a name. Lazarus writes that the problematic of the name has to be separated from any occurrence related to time on page 137. That is, if the anthropology of the name cannot think the name, or thinkability cannot yield the name, only separation or subtraction can develop a name. This is an incredible point, which is that in interiority, a group cannot bear a naming process. And that links very interestingly back to the thesis of the proper name in the Lacanian tradition, which Robyn has very eloquently elaborated. So if the anthropology of the name cannot think the name, or thinkability cannot yield the name, only separation or subtraction can do so. That is to say, quote, one can think the categories of politics one is dealing with, but one cannot think the name. Only separation of the name from its mode produces a site. The site is in interiority, while the mode is a categorical designation. These are clarificatory purposes. And I believe that the most useful reference point that helps answer the question of where is periodization in Lazarus is when you look at how he theorizes the relationship between the revolutionary mode and the mode that Marx and Engels opened in 1848, worker uprisings, and the dawn of the Communist Manifesto, which he elaborates in the French Revolution section in the studies area, which is an incredible part of the book, by the way. If the Jacobins, according to Lazarus, had only politics available to them, they had developed a series of categories of politics, but they did not have history. That is to say, the revolutionary sequence of the Jacobins was saturated at the level of history, but that saturation was not put into an effectiveness until the point at Marx and Engels were able to elevate an aspect of, let's call it contradiction, or of the prescriptive that Robespierre and company were utilizing in the French revolutionary mode, which is class struggle. In other words, there was something universalizable about class struggle that only at the meta-historical level was Marx and Engels able to universalize. And by that I mean that they obviously, as you know, turned class struggle into a type of thesis of history. Now, of course, as we've been discussing with Asad and others, class struggle is no longer that same kind of referent, because Paris Commune, Bolshevik mode, and so on. But you see the example, and I think it really helps us think about the kind of correspondence between modes. So that's what I have. Separation, ethics, and exhaustion are the three kind of motifs that I believe are worthwhile for an effort of further investigation into this very novel theory of method that this thinker is giving us. I will stop there. So we have 3 minutes for any comments before we start with Gabriel.
I had a question and kind of comment dealing with what almost seems like this like après-coup modality of exhaustion a little bit, or saturation somewhat, like with the Marx and Engels example, like it comes like after the fact of maybe the saturation of the Jacobin modality. It was just reminding me a lot in Theory of the Subject for Badiou. There's a section where he relates between politics and psychoanalysis, like the hysteric entering the psychoanalytic clinic.
Yeah, I think there needs to be some essay written on the, it's kind of like Foucault wrote all of these books and Heidegger was a major reference, but the name is never mentioned. I think in the same sense, Lazarus has the Lacanian constellation of concepts that are somehow intimate, but not invoked in their proper name, as it were, in his thought, no doubt. And I think that's true. However, I would just simply probably point to Badiou as it pertains to the psychoanalytic themes in Lazarus, which is to say, Badiou very clearly, and Gabriel has actually written a book about this, offers a new, let's call it epistemological framework for how to confront the contributions of Lacanian thought, both in politics, but also within the four conditions that he develops. So I would not really be comfortable invoking that kind of Žižekian thesis with Lazarus's periodization. I think it is slightly different and a little more singular to his own contribution. But I think you got my point, which is we have to think saturation both along a spectrum of effectiveness to the ceasing of a mode, and we have to think how the local connects to the historical, right? Through separation. So I agree that it's the, or I believe it is the most important contribution that he offers us. Okay, one more comment or thought, and we can move on to our final talk. Oh, Drew, I don't know the answer to the PhD student. Maybe you could email Michael, find out. Okay. Let me turn it over to Gabriel Tupinambá, who's obviously been a very important member of our group and really helped us in that second session, Gabriel. So now he has a case study to offer, and you have 45 minutes, my friend. Let's take your time.
Great. I'll share my screen with you guys, but before that, I just want to call attention to the amazing cat, I think, who is sitting in one of the little screens there. It's so funny. Okay. I thought everyone was paying attention to that. Sorry. Let me share
I see it's Jonathan Larson. Yeah.
Would you mind, Daniel, making me, I think you need to make me a co-host so I can share my screen.
Yeah. You bet. Okay. Yeah. Gotcha. Hold on. Let me make you co-host. Sorry. All right, you're in charge. You're the host now, my friend. There you go.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Just find it here. People who participated in that second section know that I'm fond of slides, so I'm gonna torture you with more of those now. My idea is to present to you guys a case study, but which is both more humble and much more arrogant than anything we've seen today, because it connects. It's a presentation of something I'm involved in. So. It's a very small project, but at the same time, why the hell am I presenting this to you? I hope it will make sense as we go along. And my idea is to use the case study. In fact, I'm going to introduce some problems before we get to it, so we can appreciate the case in light of certain specific issues. And my idea is to do the following. I want to talk to you guys about a certain problem that I think some people face when they're involved in different political organizations. I want to explain to you how Lazarus comes into the picture in this. It's a bit of a abstract development. And then I would like to present to you, hopefully I'll spend most of the time on this and not get lost on the preliminary comments. This organization which actually has the worst name any organization has ever had, because nobody's ever going to chant this name on the streets or even going to be able to repeat it. It's called the Circle of Studies of Idea and Ideologies, the longest name. And we didn't know that in English it would sound like CSI, which is also not that nice. But you take what you can get. So my idea is to go about it like this, to talk about the problem of political thinking in a very specific approach that is not necessarily Lazarus' approach. Then I want to measure Lazarus' contribution against that formulation of a problem. And then propose that this case study is also a case study on how to develop that problem, in part in a way that confirms or helps perhaps to clarify some of Lazarus' ideas, but also in another part, something that goes slightly in a different direction and might be useful or not to you guys. I decided to do this, let me say this beforehand, because this organization is now being here for around 10 years now, and we're inside the organization, we're going through a sort of balance sheet moment. We're kind of seeing what the hell we actually did in the last 10 years, and I'm actually this is part of the problem I want to bring and talk to you guys about, so we'll get to that at some point. So the problem that I mentioned is that I think that the question of people think or political thinking or politics as a thought can be formulated in a slightly more concrete way in the following way. Is the thought of, first of all, before I go on, can you guys see the screen, okay? Is it readable? Yeah, okay. So we can translate that question in terms of, is the thought of organization, the thought of those it organizes. So when we talk about politics thinks, politics is a thought. Are we, by saying this, committed to the idea that, well, if people think, then the thought of politics is the thought of individual people? And could it be something else other than that? And I think that we can see this issue in a very concrete light if you kind of derive 4 specific issues from this bigger theoretical question. What I call the problem of autonomization, which is actually a very simple thing. For example, in my experience in Brazil, there is almost a law of a critical mass of organizations, which means the moment that organizations have, I don't know, more than 20, 30 people, when certain protocols are necessary for things to get organized, when you need to come up with rules that are more impersonal because you no longer can trust only personal ties or personal connections to coordinate actions. When, in other words, when an organization gets autonomized in the least from those that it organizes, usually that's the main breaking point for organizations. It's almost quantifiable in terms of how many people statistically you need to break into 2 organizations. One will call the other authoritarian and will call itself the true organization. This can sometimes go on into processes of scission, as Althusser would call it, up to the quantum level. You know, we should definitely come up with the term quantum Trotskyism, when you split organizations up to the, where you are part of both, 2 of them, so below the individual level. So I call the autonomization the problem of that critical point where organizations become larger, more structured, or different even from what the people who are organized by it want it to be, think it is. Some level of consistency of the collective is in excess of the individuals that compose that collective. And I find it very interesting that most of the terms we have traditionally in political theory on the left to describe this process are negative words. It's a deviation, it's bureaucratization, it's ossification, is detachment from the base. It always, the way that we tend to perceive the autonomization of an organization from those it organizes and the emergence of something we can no longer reduce back to our own direct coordinations, there isn't much theory or thinking available, at least that I know of, or outside of very abstract philosophy, to say what it means to surf or to use or to benefit from that tendency, right? What can you do when you're organized in such a way that organizations are bigger than you? And I think that it's not for nothing that when this happens through the state or through a party, we don't feel so threatened by this process, because that's what these forms name. Well, what's in excess to me is the state. So if my organization is in excess to me, and it is therefore parliamentary, or it's a movement that has clear goals with regards to the state, this can be managed. Or the party form, things like this. So when you're organizing more autonomously and this happens and you need to deal with it, this becomes a bigger problem. So that's one of the things. Another problem concerns political words, in the sense that it's easy to see the mismatch between organized and the organization when you see an organization that, for example, relies heavily on women's domestic work so that men can be at meetings, where in the meetings they talk about feminism, social reproduction, sexual division of labor or whatever. So you can get organizations that materially rely and are thinking in a certain way, but the words that we use and the words are supposed to legitimate that we are going somewhere else. So this can happen in the most distinct ways. For example, if you have a meeting to talk about workers, or that you're inviting workers, you're probably going to get a lot of white academic students here in Brazil, because workers don't necessarily recognize themselves in that way. So those terms don't necessarily refer to what we think they do. So our organization is actually going one way while we're talking about something else. There's a certain mismatch between what an organization does and what we represent it to be doing, let's say. The third way that this problem appears in practice is the difficulty of assessing a failure in an organization. If an organization relies too heavily on the image that it is on the right path and on the recognition between the organized people that we are on the right side of something, or that we are morally superior, or that we identify in certain ways, there's almost an inverse proportion of how much we rely on representation and identification and how much failure we can admit that we had or that we went wrong. For example, men meeting to talk about social reproduction and feminist problems, sometimes they're so identified with that discourse, it's so important to distinguish them as a group that to admit failure to actually consider that question practically might dismantle the group that was talking about it already. So you can see that there is almost an inverse proportion between, again, let's say the information you extract out of what you're doing as an organization and the capacity to, let's say, absorb that information about a failure, a lesson learned, depending on how organizations represent themselves to themselves. So again, it's a matter of questioning if what we're thinking is actually what an organization is thinking. Finally, I think the problem of cognitive mapping is also interesting. It's Frederick Jameson's terms, but it's almost an epistemological approach. He treats it more as an aesthetic problem, which I think it also is. But the question is, are we sure we can see political reality individually, or are aspects of political reality only clear to us, only sensible or even intelligible through political organization? So in my personal life, I will never find certain barriers, realize how certain forces work, whereas when I'm organized and trying to get certain things happen, you can see new barriers, new obstacles, new ways of framing what's going on. So somehow there's a level of reality that gains sensible weight through organization. Again, we see a mismatch between what I experience and what is, let's say, opened up by the organizational platform as, let's say, means of experiencing. I wouldn't be able to experience that by myself. And even when I experience it in an organization, it doesn't mean that I experience it as a strong fact or something that is, let's say, in my own measure. So all those problems concern how thinking operates in politics in a certain way. But you see, I'm starting from a very, very, very localized way, not as a general theory, right? So I think that we have three big answers. I'm being very schematic here, but I also want to go quickly on this part on how we can answer or start working through these questions. Political philosophy has an answer to who thinks politically or where is thinking in politics, right? The idea, for example, that we abstract from political action or from some contemplation on the nature of politics, some thinking about it. We could say, perhaps, I think it's a very reductive view, but just to distinguish from it, Leninism as saying, well, political thinking is part of, let's say, is an interior part of political strategy. It concerns consciousness with regards to political ends. It's more immanent and it's not so theoretical in the sense of an abstraction from a struggle, but it is a process of abstraction inside the struggle. But the mediating term there perhaps might be political strategy. So summarizing it in this way. And I think this is helpful to see how Lazarus is bringing us even closer with his idea when he says, well, political thought is what gives the political process its interiority. So let's not move outside of it and let's not identify thinking with a consciousness, but thinking will be something that is at stake in a political process. So it's already something that starts to give some conceptual background to the problems that we were mentioning before, because we are allowed to ask the question within politics, but about what the hell is being thought, right? So my point is that I don't want to start from any of these three perspectives. And this is why I'm presenting you guys with a case study. I don't want to start from theory. I don't want to start politics from strategy, because you need to know something before you can strategize. But I also don't want to start with an inquiry. In the collective I'm part of, we start from the fact that we are quite lost. That's our starting point. We don't really know anything that's going on. Most of the people who join our organization are identify with the fact they're totally disoriented, not with the fact that they know what the hell's going on. So not only don't we have a clear theory, we don't have any clear strategy, and we have no anthropological interest in getting to know what is being thought somewhere else. So this already places us in a, let's say, ambivalent relation with regards to what Lazarus is doing, because at the same time that he's definitely an important author in bringing thought into politics, at the same time, as Neocosmos said, I think that was very important that he said this, that somehow political, the thought of politics, he said the thought of politics has to go through anthropology. So there remains a minimal distance, and I'll return to this. So this is how I understand very simply just the two statements that Lazarus proposes. People think means thinking is not a prerogative of theory. It happens out there where political processes are taking place. This we can affirm without checking anything. We're just stating it as an axiom, let's say. Now, what is thought, how it is thought, and where, that concerns the singularity of each process. And then he has the second statement, thinking is a relation of the real, which says something like, to learn about the singularity of a political thinking, one must abdicate of exterior approaches that turn political processes into real objects of sociology or discourse analysis, and learn to think how a given process constitutes what is real, its subject matter, within its own interior unfolding. So I really like little diagrams. So you can imagine people think as a sort of determination of an indeterminate boundary. We don't know what the hell goes on there, but we're saying that things happen inside, as Daniel mentioned, and everyone also returned to the point, things that are happening inside a certain site. In a certain location, something is going on, and it has the resources to say what it is in some terms. And the statement two, thinking is a relation of the real, means within that site, something unfolds immanently to it. And thinking is the emergence, a certain interruption, as he says, of what is at stake. What we find out as we put certain terms to the use, as we start moving around, coordinating things, something becomes at stake. It might not be what we want it to be, it might not coincide with what we say it is. We can use the word wages to talk about a fight for dignity and not for wages. But somehow around that term, something will coalesce or condense, right? So it's very nice because it doesn't treat organizations and social movements as objects to be abstractly analyzed. It is capable of distinguishing the use of circulating notions, right? These words that we use, that we extract from theory, from the actual use of concepts and ideas inside a certain reference site. And it conceives subjectivity as distinct from subject-object relations, even though it doesn't abolish this. It's not a philosophical thesis on what subjectivity is, so much as about what is subjective in politics, right? So subjective here will mean it's a process seen as a consistent interiority. Subjective is, let's say, the consistency, continuation of this unfolding of something that is at stake for some people. Now, as Neocosmos said, and I think that Robyn was also very, very keen to point this out, and which I think is very crucial, is that this remains an investigation, which is perhaps not in exteriority in the sense that Lazarus means, but let's say exterior to a political process. So what Lazarus calls a reiteration, he says, we want to think what politics thinks. That's a reiteration of the word think. But one thing happens inside politics, a political process is thinking, and the second happens outside. It happens outside in great intimacy, in a practical sense, in an inquiry sense, but it still is something that doesn't concern people who are doing stuff. Like, I don't care that you're saying that I'm thinking, I know I'm thinking, or even if I don't know, perhaps that's not even a question. So there is still, let's say, some level of exteriority that I think substitutes a problem of mediation, which is, I think is why both Neocosmos, Robyn, both introduced the problem of dialectics again and said, look, but I'm not sure this really requires us to give up on dialectics or anything like this. So in a certain sense, Lazarus puts us still outside of an interiority, no longer exterior to it, but outside of it. Let's use that distinction just to clarify things. Now, I read Lazarus together and against, and I'm sorry for the very geeky, nerdy part, with Badiou's text called The Concept of Model. In The Concept of Model, Badiou gives a definition of modeling that seems very, very scientific and mathematical or whatever, but it actually has very interesting consequences for non-mathematical practice. Because he says, look, a model, the concept of model concerns the articulation of formally homogeneous, but conceptually heterogeneous systems. So a model relation in mathematics concerns a formal system, S1 here. I'm sorry that I'm putting you guys through this. I don't have a way to highlight this, but okay. A system that is encoded into another, and this system runs its own functions, its own implicative structures, and we decode back to the first. If running the implications of one system is the same thing as encoding it into another, running the other system, and decoding it back, this S2 system is a model of S1. Now, the crazy thing is they're both formal machines. There's nothing qualitative about them that distinguishes them, one as the thing being modeled and the other that's modeling. They're homogeneous, qualitatively indistinct in that sense. But when we put them in this relation that should be a relation of equivalence, right? We're saying that one thing is equivalent to the other. The fact is that by playing heterogeneous roles, you actually learn something new. So if you, for example, model logical systems through algebraic structures, you're going to learn something new about logic. You're not going to just get a tautology. So the funny thing about this is that you have a homogeneous poles relating in heterogeneous ways. Now, it's true that this is how it operates in mathematics, but in physics, it can operate in this way. Either you will translate numbers, translate data of an experiment into numbers, and then relate numbers to other mathematical structures, so the homogeneity is guaranteed. Or you will create, for example, a physical model, like a small scale model of something to mimic and simulate what happens in a big scale physical process. Again, homogeneity, two things are physical processes, and heterogeneity. I'm going to learn something from my small scale model about the big scale model. Now, Badiou says this, and his examples don't concern science. His examples concern exactly the same thing as Lazarus' example, the human sciences and sociology. And he says, well, the notion of modeling that the human sciences use is inverted because it tries to relate heterogeneous things like kinship relations in a social system to Klein groups in mathematics, but relates them heterogeneous things in a homogeneous way. Right? And I think that Asad's example with about the idea that social science can be formalized in some, doesn't need to be mathematical sense, but in some economic theory and something like this, and then we can instantiate this into social reality and describe how it functions. Things like this, they all play into the same notion, right? The inverse relation is also possible. You can say logical systems they are, let's say, ahistorical frames of how things work. Actual reality is how we use these terms or concepts. And these two heterogeneous things can come into relation. For example, we can correct the use of concepts in reality through a formal system that tells us how these things should actually work. So you see both these cases, one of the terms is equated with reality, the other is formal. One is representation in the formal sense, the other is reality in a non-representational sense. So for Badiou, a modeling relation is an immanent articulation between homogeneous fragments of a system. So both things are made of the same stuff, but the folding of one onto the other is heterogeneous and reveals something, right? He uses this very basic insight about models and these conditions for models to be concepts of, to apply to the concept of modeling, to later on come up with this theory of generic procedures, within which politics is affirmed to be a thought because political processes can model themselves without the mediation of the state. Right? If you are into being an event, the state represents a power set of a set, but you can, and that's some way of modeling a set, but you can also model it through what he calls generic supplements, which are alternative models that are immanent to the situation. So you get a sort of introduction of a reflexive arrow where the reiteration of thought happens inside the political process and not through anthropology. It's funny because the same movement that opens up a space for philosophy for Badiou also makes politics more immanent to itself than it is for Lazarus, in my opinion. Whereas Lazarus says, we don't need philosophy, but he keeps the anthropology there. Whereas Badiou reintroduces philosophy to say that politics doesn't need it. A very interesting move. So moving from Lazarus to Badiou allows us to say that to think politically the thought of politics, meaning not to think anthropologically, but to think within politics itself, we need both the interiority and this sort of continuous process that Lazarus talks about that touches on the subject matter of something erupts as what is at stake, but we also need this reiteration to be immanent to it. We also need to be able to ask ourselves within politics, what the hell were we thinking? Or what the hell are we doing while we're saying we're doing something else? That level of disjunction between what we think we're doing, what we're actually doing and thinking, is precisely the thing that in that problem in the beginning I mentioned as a necessary disjunction that we need to learn how to deal with, right? So this brings us to the case study. I hope I still have some time. This organization is called the Circle of Studies of Idea and Ideology. It's mostly a Brazilian organization. Today, it also exists in the United States. We have members in other places. The name, as I said, is Circle of Studies. We took this name very pedantically from a bunch of philosophers. So if you read our original project from 2011, it was all about studying and disseminating Rancière, Agamben, Badiou, and Zizek's work. So it was a very kind of theoretical project. That's why it was allowed to have such a corny name, such a long name, because it was supposed to also kind of place itself in the same line of other organizations, such as the Circle of Epistemology, which happened in the 60s in France, the Russian Circles of Mathematic Exercise, which was something that happened in the beginning of the 20th century, which was also an autonomous center for studying mathematics in the case. This is a basic timeline of our project. So it starts around 2010 and goes all the way to the present. I just added some stuff here that is relevant across the years, and you'll see later on why I'm bringing this up, because this is part of what I want to talk to you about. So the project started while we still had a leftist government in Brazil. Lula's second mandate was coming to an end, and Dilma was about to be elected. Some of us were part of a presidential campaign for a candidate was similar in a certain way to Bernie Sanders. It was called Plínio de Arruda Sampaio. He was the candidate for a party, a recently created party called PSOL, the Socialism and Freedom Party, something like this. I was part of it, others were part of it, and PSOL was trying to solve an issue that it had, which is that it was created out of a bunch of fragmented tendencies from other parties, and that were dissatisfied with the left at the time. But it didn't have any internal cohesion, and it didn't know how to kind of prepare new militants as well. So they wanted to create a center for revolutionary studies. And that's where we came in. Me and others, for example, Dennis Kiao, I think he's here in the meeting. We were at the time studying new ideas for political organization, and we saw it as a chance to put them into practice, to get together with Saul in the creation of this center. the idea of the center was destroyed in like a week because each of the party tendencies didn't trust one another. So they said, we cannot work together to create a center for theoretical training of militants because we don't agree enough about what militants should learn. So the idea was dismantled, but we stuck with it and we decided to move forward with our own version of this. So we created a circle. It started in Rio de Janeiro. Around 2014, it expanded to São Paulo. Then in 2016, it expanded to 3 other states. It also created a cell in the United States, which still exists and exists until today. A lot of stuff happened in the middle of this. I'll get back to it because it will help us to talk about perhaps a bit of saturation as well. So what I wanted to show as let's say the backbone of the case is that we were created as a center for political formation. I don't know how you say this in English, like for theory courses for militants and things like this. In 1 year, we changed the nature of the organization and it became worried about how do we help the party to consolidate its administrative structure. So how do you create the infrastructure that the party needs to accommodate all the different tendencies, the different focuses of the different organizations inside of it. By 2014, we realized that organizational problems were central to political struggle in Brazil, and our guess was to peripheral countries in general, where social formations don't really produce the homogeneity required to solve certain basic organizational problems, or organizing in those conditions is different. By 2016, a lot had changed and we started creating projects to help militants and university students who had problems with money and material conditions. And we were no longer doing as a group campaigns and political work with a party and nothing like this. And more recently, we started doing a balance sheet of our previous efforts under the idea that something went wrong or something is no longer working, and we need to assess what it is and see what we're going to do to remain effective in the current situation. So why am I saying this? Because something must have gone right, because we were able to be totally wrong about what we should be doing and not disband as an organization, which is one of the problems we were talking about before. The organization was created with a concern of being plastic enough and having enough mechanisms in place to absorb failures, to absorb the fact that sometimes we don't know what we're doing and we only find out in a second moment that we were doing something different than what we thought, or that what was efficacious about it was something that we didn't consider that was serious. So that this history can have turned from campaigning and theoretical work or didactic work to something that concerns suddenly popular finance, working with slums to come up with private funds of money that they can have, like, I don't know how you call this in English, like a loan, popular loan systems, things like this. This change that didn't require any break in the organization, I think is due in part to the way that it is structured. And this is what I wanted to talk about and present to you. So this is the basic minimal unit of this organization. And this has been in place from quite early on. It took like a year for us to establish that this was the basic idea. So what is this? It says that anyone can join our organization. We don't even ask questions about politics. If you fill in a stupid form that we have that says, doesn't ask any questions that are of political, ideological nature, you are allowed in. Now, people are not in the organization because they were admitted into it. They're only in the organization if they write an anonymous annotation or a note from one meeting to a cell to the other. So if you come to one of our meetings and after it, you write a small note and you send it to us, it's like you punched a card. So you're still working with us, let's say. If you stop writing that note, we understand you no longer are part of the organization. So to belong to the organization means to be consistent in this formal engagement, doesn't mean to agree with anyone in particular. And the annotation is not only anonymous in the sense that nobody will know it was you. We make public all the annotations ever done in our organization. We're probably the organization with most material online ever. Like imagine 10 years of weekly meetings in like 4 or 5 states. So we hide from the public eye through excess of information, not from absence of it. And if you do this, you can keep coming to the meetings. If you don't do it, you understand that you no longer are interested. So what you get is that we have a very heterogeneous mixture of militants coming in because we don't have particular emblems. We don't say what we stand for. We see if people stand being, like if they tolerate being in an environment that is that heterogeneous. If their political positions doesn't tolerate that, they probably will prefer go elsewhere. If they tolerate that sort of organization, then they can stay. And we do have anarchists, all sort of communist thinkers, socialists, people who don't care about politics, they just like the company. We don't ask that sort of question. And in principle, it's for us, it's kind of irrelevant because that's not really where we start from organization. So people come with different organizational problems. Sometimes they are in our group and they are in a party, they are in a trade union organizing, they are inscribed in many different projects. Some of these projects don't really go well together. Some are hardcore kind of Brazilian Communist Party militants and other are hardcore anarchists and they are both in the same organization. What happens is that they all create these annotations from one meeting to the other where they, for example, complain about one another, or they say that the only politics that is good politics is this one, or they complain about the organization, like you guys say you're such good commies, but I don't have bus fare money to come to the meetings, like you hypocrites. So in the next meeting, when we read all of these, new problems emerge. And people who are actually saying, supposedly saying things that don't match the anarchist guy, the commie guy, they might have written very similar notes. So the way that their problems are now meshed together is not something that any person thought in particular, because the way that we're going to put these things together, God knows how it's going to go well together or not. So what we do then, which is the second level of the organization, is that we take these problems and rather than saying, okay, get out of here, or this organization is not for you, if you don't like something that some other person is doing, we say, why don't you go and create a subset, a group inside the organization that does the thing that you think should be done. If you think what's missing is serious theoretical study of Marx, go do it. We'll help you. People who are in the organization are web designers, teachers at a university, or whatever. They can help you out with that. So we don't really block any ideas, and we don't decide who is right and who is wrong based on ideological discussion. We organize so that people can actually put together groups that do what they want to do, with the smaller consensus groups that they can find for people who want to do that thing with them. Like a club, perhaps, right? So the validity of the problems and solutions are decided through the creation of these smaller groups that then gain some autonomy and work on their own. But since people are a subset, these people are a subset from the circle, so they also go to the cell meetings and we still get information about what they're doing through these annotations. So they might say, well, you know, we thought studying Marx would make us feel better, but it's not really cutting it, you know, or others will say, we decided to work with a certain perspective together with a trade union in a certain project and it didn't pan out well, or it was a really good and we learned this and that. So these things are introjected as a feedback into the organization. For the more mathematically inclined, you will realize that subsets concern the power set of a set. So there is already like a flavor of modeling problems in there if you're interested. So a lot has changed throughout our history concerning what we did in these meetings. So for example, in 2012, we used to do political theory classes. If you came to a meeting, you would see usually me acting like a big teacher and writing complicated stuff on a blackboard and saying, you need to know this to be a serious political militant, or something like that. And very quickly, this became absolutely untenable or uninteresting even, because nothing would come out of it. And we had many problems with this, mostly organizational, either because you could see who was actually coming to the meetings and it wasn't that equal at all. You could see how intellectuality, especially in a place like Brazil, is a very important socially distinctive operator. So people who understand, people who don't understand. There's a lot of humiliation to be in a room where people are talking with big words and thinking that that's very important. There's also, there was already not very much interest from the party that I mentioned in kind of supporting this idea. So a lot changed about what we do in these meetings that kind of brings together this heterogeneous group of people. And a lot changed in the sort of subsets that people decided to create as we went along, out of the problems that emerged from being put together with people with different political attitudes or political backgrounds as them. So of course, group studies for all sorts of classical or important thinkers. We put together academic or non-academic conferences. We came up with, in partnership with the PSOL party, we created base organizations in different cities and locations. We actually did give some theoretical course for militant formation, campaign work, but slowly something changed. And this list is not exclusive, it's cumulative. So these things remained, but they were added on to things that don't really look like it. So with the passing of time, we were starting to get calls to give therapeutic assistance to organizations, because militants were suffering in the organizations. We started coming up with solutions to those problems based on taking into the consideration the fact that militant work is actually a sort of work. It's also a way that you use your efforts and your time. And in a situation of large informal work structure like we have in Rio and Brazil, the way that you need to choose between doing political work or surviving sometimes is not really taken into consideration by organizations in such a way that political work becomes a very superegoic, excessive imperative on top of all the imperatives you already have by trying to stay alive and have a decent job or family or something like this. So we realized that something had to be done, something had to be changed in a way that we approached political life, where the question of militant work would be kind of included into political economy, sort of political economy of militancy, because we couldn't conceive militancy anymore, activism or whatever you want to call it, as something that breaks away with the social discourse of the management of time. So an organization that doesn't know that it is managing someone's time, consuming someone's time, that it is distributing and reorganizing that time, is not really thinking, in our opinion, what's going on, as let's say, what's at stake in the life of a militant in Brazil anymore. So I'm just trying to show here that we have a scansion in the middle of our little existence, where we began with a main articulation with a party. Our political discussions were about what is the role of electoral politics and what is not, how we go beyond the state, things like this. Our theoretical discussions were mostly around the history of socialism, how much socialism, how much of this history should you inherit, how much symptom there is in the sort of absolute avoidance of this. And we focused a lot on philosophical discussions with the sort of new communist thinkers like Badiou, Negri, those guys. Somehow, nobody decided on this. This is no one's idea. That's the funny thing. Something changed, and the sort of project and theory and ideas and way of speaking that we started using after a while was much more focused on social reproduction issues within militant organizations. So it was a view to the inside. It was an attempt to focus on the question of political economy of militancy, a reevaluation of how we talk about money, about time. We started coming up with projects for self-sustaining militant work, where the idea that you're doing something that needs to be somehow recognized as work should be included in the way that we organize. And we started being called and also coming up with projects that take into consideration how this level of organization and self-reproduction of organizations affects the militant subjectivity. We understand today, and this is the balance sheet moment that we are doing, that this change happened, this scansion has something to do with the way that 2014 and between 14 and 16, the crisis of 2008 really affected Brazil. It was like delayed a bit. We had the impeachment in 2016 of Dilma. We were very much involved in municipal elections in 2016, and all the campaigns we were part of failed miserably and in ways that had to do with the way that they exploited militant work. And the feminist movement also came to the fore in Brazil, and it was already, of course, very active, but it became, in my opinion, the central category or the central force of mobilization, especially once Bolsonaro was elected. Between Dilma's impeachment, our first women president, and Bolsonaro's election, whose main opposition was women in the streets with a particular slogan, not him, ele não. I think the feminist critique coming to the fore was also an influence, but it would never have been possible for us to rethink what we were doing, or even think what the hell it is we were doing before, if the structure of the organization couldn't somehow absorb that failure or that saturation of that way of talking about things. So saturation for me here, I'm not necessarily saying that it means what Lazarus says it means, but I think a very good way of understanding it is saying that political words are born, they are kind of baptized by certain reference and certain struggles, but they can have a life that exceeds that reference. So political forces can change, political subjectivity can change, social relations can change, and the names remain. And it's saturation in the sense that anyone who, I mean, I'm absolutely kind of addicted to sugar. So I know what saturation is every time I drink coffee, and I put so much sugar in it sometimes that like doesn't even get mixed into the water anymore. You know, it just condenses in the below. And I think a lot of political words are like that. And a lot of our political words and our political concepts started to be in the bottom of the organization, like this remains that no longer really mix together with the movement of the political coffee. Why not, right? So just to conclude, what I think that we learned in the process is that if you look at this very crazy graph here, imagine that this line here, right, it's where it's inside of this process of the circle. People are admitted, anyone can come in, so we get a heterogeneous group of people together. When you try to create something that has some equality amongst different people, you find out that equality is impossible in the technical sense that impossibility is something that bars a certain formalism from fully deploying itself, right? So problems emerge. And what we learned, and I think it's singular about this particular process, is that we don't try to do away with these problems, but they become, let's say, the source, the subject matter of subsets that go on formulating what has gone wrong and coming up with solutions that address the problem inside our organization. So what I think is crucial here in this point is that we didn't really look outside to other people and see what they needed. Our militants were all poor, precarious, students they're no longer able to stay at the university, informal people that were moving from formal jobs to informal labor situations. So in the inside of our organization, these problems emerge. We didn't have to imagine what the people need, what classes are required. There is a sort of interior emergence of this problem, and then we don't try to solve it for others. We try to solve it for ourselves. So how can I keep the people in this organization alive in need of, since they need more money and they don't have time? How do you organize in those conditions? And in the cases where we found good solutions to this, then we offer those solutions to other organizations. And we come up with partnerships with trade unions, parties, social movements, student movements, and we say, look, we know a bit about how to deal with this. We know how to name that problem in a different way. And perhaps this is useful for you and we can do things together. So that's basically what we do, where I find the crucial part is this, that problems start to emerge inside the organization. What I find useful about this, and I think it's a very Althusserian kind of ironic twist, that there is some truth to the idea that you only think when you can formulate the object inside your own system. So objects are something that you constitute inside an already moving frame, right? It's just the case that the frame is not theory, the frame is organization itself. As you can see, this crazy diagram here respects the condition for what Badiou calls a model. The subsets that try to think through what we're doing and we didn't see, they are also collective organizations. And the problem is happening at a collective organization. So there is a homogeneity between the two levels, right? I'm gonna shut up now because I think I already put you through too many arrows and slides. But yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity also to talk about this. Half of what I'm presenting here to you guys, I didn't really come up with. I owe it to two guys in my group at the Circle, Vito and Vanessa, and they came up with the idea of what to present. I offered to put photos of them at the end of the presentation, but they were too embarrassed. So, yes.
Beautiful, man. Bravo. Nice work. That was a tour de force, Gabriel. It's overtime, and I want to respect your evening, your Saturday evening.
But that's lost already, don't worry.
Yeah. Maybe you've already made plans to go out, given that it's actually quite nice weather, at least on the East Coast here in the US. But let me open it up. I know some folks are familiar with Gabriel's project that are with us. If they wish to jump in, that would be great. Or if there's any other general questions. We've had a very nice chat about similar models, Gabriel, which you can reference before we close. There's actually a really interesting psychosocial model that Jesse raised that's worth looking at. It's apparently a very similar structure.
Yeah, so we did take a lot of inspiration from Laborde and especially from Dion's work with therapeutical groups.
Interesting. Very good. I don't want to monopolize. I want to turn it over. So jump in with any thoughts or comments or questions, please.
Can you say something about how you avoid contradiction becoming antagonistic, or how you avoid antagonism becoming destructive to the group? I mean, I think in the United States we're more familiar with that trajectory. I mean procedurally, you know, not necessarily ideologically, but what's the sort of inoculation against that?
I don't know. I mean, there's, I don't know, no inoculation. I don't think we try to avoid that sort of thing. But one thing that it's nice that you mentioned, which is funny, is that one joke that people make in the circle sometimes is that in Brazil, Mao Zedong has to be inverted, because the antagonistic contradictions are the ones within the people, and the contradictions with the ruling class are not antagonistic, right? So it's much harder to put three guys from three different organizations or from, let's say, different parcels of a class social composition, like people who are in informal work, people who are academics or precarized students, and people who are manual workers in some form of continuation of more classical working conditions. To put them together and to organize their interests in the same direction is much harder than to put a worker and his, how do you call him? His boss in the same room. So we play around with that idea that this is, but I don't know, it's very funny. We're studying this right now, because for the last 10 years, of course, many people came and went to the organization. I think perhaps 400, 500 people. Some people were unimpressed. Most people were unimpressed. In fact, in Brazil, when you join an organization, you expect to be joining some sort of revolutionary guerrilla group, or at least a group that pretends to be that while they study Marx. And they were disappointed both ways. But still, we never had any sort of rupture point. Like, this I cannot stand, will break the group. I don't know why, but I don't think that really happened. We have other sort of contradictions, but I think that, I don't know, just out of experience, we didn't have to deal with that in those terms. But we do think that this is a, let's say, an organizational process that is tailored to the sort of to the way that contradictions inside, let's say, the working class in Brazil appears. I think that peripheral economies, usually with their way that they mix overexploitation and conditions of informal labor and formal labor, and the way that the middle class is structured, things like this create very kind of pointy fragments. It's very hard to bring them together if you need them to relate at an ideological level. Whereas we totally abdicate from that in a first glance. And we have that politics that if you want to fight somebody, really fight them, you need to build the fighting ring, right? And that thing you can do together with them, you can break his face later on. So we're worried about building the ring. If you want to break the guy's face afterwards, that's your problem. But for some reason, when you spend a lot of time building something with other people, sometimes you forget what it is, why you hated them to begin with. So that usually happens.
Gabriel, let's have one more intervention, one more thought, and then we'll just close it down. We're going to get together again. We'll just find a time to get to do our final session. And, you know, given that this went so well, maybe we can do another activity together. We can, I don't know, find out if there's interest. But let us hear if there's got to be some burning thoughts or comments. Jump in. I know we have folks that were actually a part of this effort with us right now, based in Brazil, some based in the US. And I, first of all, yeah, Gabriel, please post the presentation slides on Slack. One sort of, yeah, nobody's jumping in, but one thing that interests me with what you're talking about here is this consequentialism of interiority. Could you say a little bit more about that? I was slightly like confused, just a clarificatory question.
Yeah, it sounded smarter than what I said, though.
Yeah, because we're good Marxists. We're good Marxists. We reject this consequential paradigm. But yeah, go ahead. What do you mean by that? If you could be.
No,
like...
I think that the main issue concerns two ways to think about interiority, right? I think I think this is the basic problem behind, let's say, a quick reading of a lot of post-Marxist literature. The idea that, well, if you're trusting the autonomy of political processes, are you necessarily also trusting the immediate representation that people make of their own struggles? And I mean, not only you as somebody who's outside as an anthropologist, but you as part of that movement. Do you need to trust, or is the knowledge of what you're doing, is the thinking that's going on, not conditioned on your capacity to distinguish between, let's say, what you say or think or imagine that you're doing and what's actually taking place, right? Isn't there some separation there? And I think that you can come up with ways of distinguishing that from outside that are not exterior. For example, the anthropology of the name is an outside way of not being exterior about it, saying that division is immanent. Just pay attention when you go there to the distinction between names, categories, and so on. But if you want to stay inside, if you're working on something and you need to make that distinction, sometimes it's not very easy to know what to lean against. You lean against the big authors like, I'll go back to Marx to decide if this was a good idea or a bad idea. Do you lean on feelings? Do you lean on your anxiety? Like, if this is making me uncomfortable, it's probably a bad idea. And I think that consequentialism means that we judge it by its effects. Meaning the point of distinction is efficacy from inside. The point of distinction is not definitional content. This is not how it should be done. That's not the best way to approach it. So I mean, by consequentialism, I mean that if you want to move even further into the interiority of a political thought, it means also to come up with ways of assessing what is effective and what is not effective, right? And I think that this is a bit, let's say, the principle for this subsets that we come up with. We say, well, if you can maintain it, if there's desire to do it, if people are into it, and if it produces good things, so I guess that was a good path to take rather than a bad one. But we cannot assess that before something happens at the level of organization. So consequentialism means that organizations think what organizations were thinking, and not that anthropologists, militants, or philosophers, they think what politics was thinking. So that's why I began with that kind of frustrating model relation graph, right? Because that's pretty much what's at stake.
Mm-hmm. I love it. I hope that you continue to sort of publish the findings of what appears to be like a very unique place that you're in at the moment, which is this kind of retroactive looking back position, and it's really generating quite a lot of formal knowledge that can be applied to other locations. So it's useful for all of us.
I really hope so.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing that. Well, thank you for all the presenters, for Neocosmos and Robyn and Asad and Gabriel. This has been a real blessing, honestly, to be a part of this, and hope you all have a great night. Thanks for, spending the last 3 hours with us. It flew by. And thanks to Gabriel for such a stellar, detailed presentation. We'll post a video on YouTube for folks that could not join us. And I'll send out a poll for the Win the Best Time to Meet for the final session. Okay?
Great.
Cheers.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye-bye.